My very dear friend Sasaki-san, who's the new chairman. We've known each other for many years, and this is a wonderful new venue where we know each other in a new way, working on policy issues together. Before I start, when we have public events, we always have a little safety announcement. I'm going to be responsible for you, or Mike Green or Matt Goodman. If we hear an announcement that we have to evacuate, the doors are right behind me. This door is the one that's closest to the street. We will take the stairs down, take 2 left-hand turns, a right-hand turn. We'll go over to National Geographic, and I think I'll get you all tickets so you can see the new exhibit on the Queens of Egypt. It's a great show. Nothing will happen, but I want you to be prepared just as we are. We're very honored that Stephanie Murphy is with us today. A remarkable member of Congress who's a rising star in the Democratic Party. We're very pleased, and we do have a limited amount of time because she has a trade hearing that she's going to. She's on the Trade Subcommittee of Ways and Means, and that's one of the few power committees in the Congress. Congresswoman Murphy comes with a very interesting background to having been an educator, a businesswoman, now committing herself to public policy, and she is an intellectual leader. She is leading the so-called Blue Dogs, which is the moderate Democrats in the House that are trying to chart a sensible path forward, and trade is at the core of that. And no one spends more time thinking about this than Congresswoman Murphy. Would you please, with your warm applause, welcome this remarkable leader, Congresswoman Stephanie Murphy. Thank you.
Thank you, John. I really appreciate the kind introduction. And thank you to CSIS and JETRO for inviting me to speak. I'm really honored to be here. Given the sizable Japanese presence at this event, I think it's appropriate to begin with a little confession. In the summer after my junior year in college, I actually lived in Japan and worked at Canon, where I was responsible for translating the company's technical documents from English to Japanese. And I'd studied Japanese for about 2 years in college, and I arrived in Tokyo incredibly college confident in my skills. And that confidence faded rather quickly when, after my first translation was returned to me covered in red ink. So it didn't get much better after that. If you have trouble with a Canon copier, you probably can blame me. So I really did, though, despite my language issues. I had a wonderful time in Japan, and I learned so much, including a very valuable lesson in humility. Thankfully, we can now pivot, or maybe it's better to say rebalance, to a discussion from my linguistic shortcomings to a discussion of U.S. economic engagement in the Asia-Pacific region. It's the most economically dynamic region in the world, and by virtually any metric. Like Asia itself, this topic is vast and complex, with 1,000 worthy subtopics to discuss. But I'm going to focus on just 3 interrelated themes. They are the ongoing U.S. efforts to counter an increasingly assertive China through the use of economic statecraft, the January 2017 decision by President Trump to withdraw the United States from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and the President's scattershot tariff policy. Before I go into that, I think it's, if you'll give me some personal privilege to tell you a little bit about myself, I think it's important to start there because they say that where you stand on an issue depends on where you sit. And my views on U.S. international economic policy in general and towards Asia specifically are informed by my current position in Congress and by the characteristics of the district that I represent. I'm a moderate Democrat who represents an area in Central Florida, so that Orlando area. It's about a third Democrat, a third Republican, and a third independent. And I take real pride in being bipartisan, and I believe that that's been a key to my being effective in Congress. I'll speak up when I believe President Trump or congressional Republicans are wrong, but I don't criticize them reflexively, and I don't take any particular joy in it. Florida is highly dependent on international trade. Trade supports nearly 2.4 million jobs in our state, which is nearly 1 in 5 workers. Florida exports over $50 billion a year in goods and over $40 billion a year in services. And about 30,000 Florida companies import products. Although it's hard to measure with precision, imports keep prices down and increase choice for Florida consumers. With respect to foreign direct investment, foreign-owned companies employ about 350,000 workers in Florida. For example, over 20,000 Floridians work for firms based in Japan. So these data points help explain why I'm proud to describe myself as a pro-trade Democrat. I believe that trade and investment liberalization policies, if crafted in a thoughtful way, can enhance the quality of life for the people I represent. And my constituents don't tend to be hostile or skeptical towards these policies, so long as I, as their representative, detail the many benefits that these policies bring and honestly discuss the disruptions they may cause in certain sectors, and then work hard to minimize those disruptions rather than being indifferent to them. And that's my general approach, whether we're considering U.S. economic policy towards Asia, Latin America, or any other region of the world. In addition, my views on the value of U.S. engagement in Asia are influenced by my personal background and my professional experience prior to Congress. There's an emotional dimension to my position, and it's not just an intellectual one. So there are 541 members of Congress, and I'm one of only 5 born in the Asia-Pacific, in an Asia-Pacific country. I was born in Vietnam about 3 years after the end of the Vietnam War. I'll save you the trouble of doing the math in your head. I'm just hit the big 4-0 last year. But my parents, because they had been affiliated with the South Vietnamese government and the U.S. military and were being persecuted by the new communist government, decided to escape Vietnam by boat when I was just a baby. And we ran out of fuel in the middle of the South China Sea. And a U.S. Navy ship responded to our SOS call, and they provided us with fuel, food, and water that allowed us to make it to a Malaysian refugee camp. And that moment for me really crystallized what I think makes America great. And it is this unique combination of power and leadership and generosity. It's the power and leadership that deploys the U.S. Navy thousands of miles from the U.S. Borders to ensure freedom of navigation, that international commerce can go on, and that people are safe on the seas. Their forward presence deters conflict. But it's also that generosity that has men and women who were trained for combat decide to extend grace to desperate strangers. And I don't mean to sound sentimental, but I'm alive today because of this unique combination of American leadership and American power and American generosity. And so I think that, as you can imagine, in light of my story, I tend to be really skeptical of arguments made by American politicians, whether they're Republican or Democrat, that the United States should step back from its leadership responsibilities on the global stage. I'm inclined to believe that such a retreat, however tempting it might sound at first blush, would ultimately make America and our allies less prosperous and make the world less stable and safe. My belief in the overriding importance of American leadership, of the judicious use of American power, and of American-led alliances was reinforced as a result of the years I spent working at the Department of Defense after 9/11. During posts at in the Pentagon and out at the U.S. Pacific Command, I helped to shape U.S. military policy and develop partnerships in the Asia-Pacific region. I got an opportunity to help negotiate the U.S.-Singapore Strategic Framework Agreement. I participated in mill discussions between the U.S. Navy and the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Forces. I helped plan special operations and counterterrorism across Asia, and then authored the guidance that set forth how our military would use its forces in the region. But I'll have to say the most rewarding work that I did was my involvement in the U.S. military's response to the 2004 tsunami in Indonesia, which evolved into a multinational operation featuring countries like Japan and Australia, Singapore, and Malaysia. During my time at DoD, I was reminded again and again how effective the U.S. can be when it sets clear objectives, forms coalitions of willing nations that share those objectives, and leads those coalitions in a strategic and respectful way. And it's a lesson that I take with me into Congress. With that as a backdrop, let me return to the three themes that worry me most about the state of U.S. economic policy in Asia and the connection between them. First is what might be called the X factor, the multidimensional challenge posed by China under Xi Jinping to the U.S.-led international order, especially in the Asia-Pacific region. There's an emerging consensus that the U.S. and China have entered a period defined by confrontation and competition that will be won or lost in that gray area short of kinetic action. At its core, this is a contest over divergent values and interests. It's a contest between opposed political and economic systems and between different visions for the future of Asia and the world writ large. On the political front, it's a contest between authoritarian rule and democratic rule. On the economic front, it's a contest between a state-led model and a market-based model. And it's a contest in which I believe the United States must prevail. To compete effectively with China, it's imperative for the United States to strengthen economic engagement in the Asia-Pacific through increased trade and investment, and not to succumb to protectionist impulses. I would note that every U.S. multinational enterprise worth its salt understands that they cannot be a successful global company unless they have a meaningful presence in Asia or a strategy to attain one. But American firms are working against considerable headwinds emanating out of Washington. And that brings me to the second theme I mentioned, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. In one of his first acts in the Oval Office, President Trump withdrew the United States from TPP. The president could have sought to renegotiate aspects of the agreement he didn't like, or he could have sent the agreement to Congress for our review, potential modification, and approval or disapproval. But instead, he made a unilateral decision that's going to have multilateral consequences for years to come. And many of my congressional colleagues on both sides of the aisle have been less than forthcoming on this subject. So let me be clear. I think America's withdrawal from TPP was a serious strategic error. I assume it was met by cheers in Beijing, loud enough to drown out the groans in Tokyo and Hanoi. We had the opportunity to unify the region around an American-designed system of commerce and to check China's rising influence, and we squandered it. Thanks to Japanese leadership, the 11 other TPP nations went ahead with the agreement in our absence, lowering tariffs among themselves and basically leaving American companies at a competitive disadvantage. How anyone could argue this is a result that is in our national best interest is really beyond me. In my view, the U.S. has compounded this error through the president's impulsive use of tariffs on friends and foes alike, which is my third source of concern. I suppose we can have a reasonable debate over the wisdom of President Trump's decision to impose 25% tariffs on $250 billion worth of Chinese imports and to threaten tariffs on the remaining $300 billion in response to Chinese trade practices that I think nearly everyone agrees are abusive. But for my part, I view tariffs as the foreign policy equivalent of trying to punch someone else and punching yourself harder. Despite the president's constant claims to the contrary, it is American companies and American consumers that bear the brunt of these taxes on imports. And in addition, U.S. exporters have been harmed by China's shrewd application of counter tariffs, raising tariffs only on select products with the United States and lowering tariffs for their other trading partners. With no end in sight to this trade war between the world's two biggest economies, it's never been more vital for the U.S. to work closely with its allies in Asia and Europe who share our concerns about China's unfair trade practices. We should be building a unified coalition along the lines that I used to witness every day at the Department of Defense to maximize the chance of getting China to make real structural changes. But that's not what we're doing. And instead of joining forces to take on China, we're fighting with our friends over secondary issues. And that's because the president has imposed steel and aluminum tariffs on our allies as well as our adversaries, based on a flimsy national security justification. Affected countries have imposed retaliatory tariffs on us, just as the Chinese have. And in some cases, importing firms in these nations have shifted their supply chains in order to source products from other non-tariffed countries. American exporters are paying the price right now, and they may be paying the price well into the future. Even if these various tariff wars come to an end, there's no guarantee that foreign importers will shift their supply chains back to firms in the United States, because we'll become viewed to many as unreliable trading partners. So to be clear, the Chinese are opportunistic. In the same way that they took advantage of the American military's preoccupation in the Middle East over the last 2 decades to vastly advance their own military capabilities, they are now taking advantage of our retreat from the global trading regime to advance their own economic position. If this is what U.S. leadership looks like, we can do better. And if this is what U.S. economic engagement in the Asia-Pacific region looks like, we can do better. And if this is how we intend to prevail in this generational competition against China, we can do better, and we must do better. In summary, I'm concerned that the Trump administration's policies on TPP and tariffs are undermining the effectiveness of our broader policy towards China, which we must get right given the stakes involved for our national security and our economy. And that's one reason I've come to the conclusion that Congress, acting on behalf of the American public, should play a far more muscular role when it comes to U.S. trade and tariff policy. It starts with better and more bipartisan oversight by Congress of the President's trade policies. For example, I think Congress should hold a hearing on the benefits and costs of rejoining TPP and on additional ways to fortify our trading relationships with countries in the region, always in a way that strengthens labor and environment and other standards. We should have the vigorous debate that President Trump unilaterally foreclosed. But I think we have to go beyond this. Over the years, Congress has chosen to delegate much of its constitutional authority to regulate foreign commerce to the executive branch. The current president has used that authority recklessly at best and abused this authority at worst, harming American businesses, consumers, and alliances in the process. I think the time has come for Congress to reclaim its fair share of this authority, so we have a greater say in tariff decisions before they're made, especially tariff decisions that are justified on the dubious national security logic. I intend to introduce legislation in the coming days that would fine-tune the balance of power between Congress and the President. And with that, I want to thank you again for inviting me. I hope you enjoy the rest of today's event. You're discussing incredibly important issues, and I appreciate being here with you this morning. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Congresswoman. That was your personal story, your experience in the Defense Department, the strategic, and you didn't mention your business experience, and of course representing your constituency brings a 360-degree clarity to this problem, and then you're speaking about American leadership on trade and Congress leading on trade, which for this audience I think is really a powerful message. The Congresswoman has agreed to take a few questions in Japanese. Just kidding. I'm going to ask 1 or 2 questions, and I think we can then take some from the audience, if it's okay. You make a very strong case for why it was a mistake for the U.S. to unilaterally withdraw from TPP, and gave us a very clear signal about what you're going to try to do about it. Prime Minister Abe, with the CPTPP, TPP-11, is in many ways holding a place for us while we get our act together. I'm wondering if there's a message you can send to our trading partners who want this coalition of like-minded states to make the rules in Asia about how it is that the U.S. will get back to that place. I know it's a fight, but what are some of the encouraging things that you can tell us about?
Well, first I want to recognize Japanese leadership in the region, both on an economic perspective as well as from a security perspective. I think it's been really incredible to see the progress and how Japan is leading in the region. So certainly appreciate what they've done, especially as it relates to the trade policy. I think in the United States, trade has almost become a 4-letter word. And that's why you don't see the kind of leadership that we need to see, both in Congress and in the executive branch, in order to get us back to a place where we can lead this country to take our seat back within the global trading regime, right? One that we spent so much time painstakingly building with our allies. And so that it starts there. It starts at being able to articulate to my constituents, to Americans across this country, the importance of trade. And in order to have the space to do that, to talk and maneuver within the trade policy realm, we also have to, as a government, care about the adjustments and the displacement. And I think when a government is indifferent to the displacement, you start to lose the support of the public and the American people that allows you to have the trust you need to move forward on trade policy. And so there's a lot that we can do there, and I'm not sure that our adjustment policies over the last few decades have been effective. So we need to relook at the types of adjustment policies we have, continue to fight for and defend labor, environmental enforcement provisions, and then find a way to communicate and grow more voices willing to be vocal about trade.
Since 2016, the polls that we've tracked, Chicago Council and others, actually show an increase in public support for trade, for TPP. So in some ways it feels like what's needed is some leadership, and really we applaud you for what you're doing. Our theme, this is the 14th year that CSIS and JETRO are doing this, and for 13 years the theme was, how do we measure integration within Asia? And this year, after consulting with our colleagues in JETRO, we thought we needed to ask a little more difficult question, which is this one: is the U.S. decoupling from Asia's economic architecture? And you sent a warning that that's in some ways what we're doing with our trade policy. There's another aspect to this which you would know from your national security experience, which is Huawei, 5G technology. So there is a debate about whether there are some areas where, for legitimate national security reasons, not the made-up ones related to steel tariffs, but for legitimate national security reasons, we may need to decouple in some areas. And I'm wondering if this is on the agenda for you now on the House Ways and Means Committee and the Congress, and what the temperature is on that question.
Well, certainly I think that economic policy and national security policy has always been interrelated, in the sense that we believe tighter integration between two countries tends to be a buffer to prevent conflict, right? And we're definitely looking at the national security, the uses of national security authorities to restrict trade. I think there are legitimate, as you said, there are legitimate concerns that we have to address of China's behavior in the region insofar as, and then there are certain industries that we have to protect and ensure that our supply chain is reliable, because the end products that they are in matter too much to our national security and our military to leave it to not have a supply chain that is workable. And so we are looking at this. There are a number, the bill that I'm going to introduce this week actually takes a second look and tries to balance the powers between the President's use of 232 of IEPA, of the Foreign Powers Act, all of those things that he's used, because there are situations in which the President should be able to use that. But I always liken it to when the President sends service members into harm's way. At some point he has to come to Congress and ask for permission. But he has that authority in the near term for a real national security emergency to send U.S. forces. I think same is true if he's going to put economic or American businesses and American consumers into economic harm's way. He should also come back to Congress at some point and allow us to have a say as we represent the American people. And so we are looking at that balance, recognizing that there are things that we need to address, but also that Chinese behavior that we need to address, but doing so in a way that is more aligned using our allies, working together with our allies, and then checking the use of national security economic authority.
That's a really important topic.
Yeah.
And the Constitution has something to say about that,
Yes.
too, of course. I think you have time perhaps maybe for one question in English from the audience. Yes?
Try my
Right.
Japanese.
Where's my microphone team? There we go. Could you identify yourself briefly and keep the question a bit short?
Thank you, Mike. I'm Tom Reckford with the Foreign Policy Discussion Group. I was very impressed with all the points that you made on trade and tariffs and TPP. I wonder how many people on your own subcommittee and in the Ways and Means Committee in general share your views.
Well, I think a fair number of people do share the view of being pro-trade. In fact, the New Dem Coalition, which is a Democratic coalition that advertises itself as being a pro-trade organization, has over 100 members. I'm a part of that, as well as the leader of the Blue Dogs. So I think there are a lot of people who do see the benefits of trade, share some of these positions. But as I said in my speech, or in my remarks, I'm not seeing I have had other colleagues who have not taken a very public or assertive position on this. And from a political perspective, coming out and saying this when it's an issue that they're just glad they don't have to deal with anymore because it's, we're not taking a vote on it, is politically convenient, but it's not good for, from a policy perspective.
I think we can do one more. Sir, right here in the front table. Keep your hand up so they can find you if you could. Thanks.
My name is Hung Tran from the Atlantic Council, and thank you very much for your succinct remarks. You mentioned a lot about TPP, but leaving TPP aside, in your view, are there any mechanism, forum, and so on that the U.S. can right now enhance collaboration and to strengthen our position in Asia?
Other forums to enhance our position in Asia? Well, there are a number of other forums that we help create. What I'm concerned about, though, is that we currently have an administration that hasn't properly staffed the entities that would otherwise engage with those organizations, whether it's Asean or, the military, mill-to-mill. If you look over at the State Department, they're not they don't have the staffing that they need to engage robustly the way that we do. Over at Commerce, do we have enough people to be at the table setting the terms? And I'll share with you one specific example that I'm really concerned about is everybody talks about this technological competition between the U.S. and China. And I believe our technology is built for democratizing purposes, and that's kind of how we've seen it. It's made for a rowdy political environment in the U.S. But China looks at technology to assert its authoritarian, tech dystopia. And these two models are competing. Well, to date, the U.S. model of technology has been leading because we were at the table setting the standards and, defining the terms by which people were going to engage. And right now, I don't see where we're leading in that. Europe has put out privacy rules. We haven't been able to get together to do that. I lead a coalition, I chair Future Forum, which is 49 of the youngest members of the Democratic Caucus. And this is an area that we are taking up. We're doing privacy roundtables because the United States has to have a vision for what we think, what does the scaffolding of legislation and regulation, both domestically and internationally, what does that look like so that we continue to promote a democratizing type of technology and not allow the authoritarian tech dystopia to be the one setting those terms?
Congresswoman Murphy has to get back to a Ways and Means Committee hearing, and I can certainly say for my part, she's really convinced me that we need her to be there. Her leadership is just really impressive to witness, and we wish you fair winds, and thank you very much for helping us to start this conference.
Thank you so much. Have a good day.
Let me continue. I don't think I introduced myself before. I'm Mike Green, the Senior Vice President for Asia and Japan Chair here. And together with my colleagues Matt Goodman and Nick St. Cheney, we're really proud to be partnering with JETRO for the 14th time, looking at East Asian regional integration. We have a little bit of a spicy title for this year's conference, but it's not about publicity, it's about a legitimate concern a lot of us have. So we'll dive into this today, and we have clickers and things to allow the participation from the audience as we go forward. We're going to hear next some remarks from the administration. Mark Napper is the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Korea and Japan. He was in Seoul as a Chargé d'Affaires from 2017 to 2018. A not inconsequential time on the Korean Peninsula. And he's had earlier assignments as director for India, Japan. I think I first met Mark when he was a Kaban Mochi, a staff assistant to then Ambassador Mondale. And he has really made his mark on U.S.-Japan relations. So Mark also has to get back to the department pretty quickly, so we're going to invite him up to the stage to hear his remarks, and then we'll turn to Sasaki-san. Mark, thank you for joining us.
Hi, good morning. Thank you, Mike, for that kind introduction. I have a similar, what Congresswoman Murphy called college confidence anecdote regarding my Japanese skills. And that was when I was a junior in college, I decided to compete in a Japanese language contest. And I was invited as a finalist to Washington, D.C., actually, to compete. And I came in third, which sounds great, except for the fact that there were only 4 finalists. So anyways, I'll endeavor to do better today. But really, thank you, CSIS, thank you, JETRO, for inviting me today and for hosting this conference on this important subject, is the United States decoupling from Asia's economic architecture? And my hope this morning is that my remarks on the U.S. vision for a free and open Indo-Pacific, together with an update on our energy and infrastructure initiatives, will make the case that the United States is in fact not decoupling, and rather is doubling down on our commitment to the region. So the U.S. vision to advance a free and open Indo-Pacific is based on this administration's belief that the Indo-Pacific is among the United States' most important, if not the most important, priority, a priority that President Trump laid out in his address to the APEC CEO Summit in Vietnam in 2017. And adding to that, in November of last year, Vice President Pence reaffirmed the U.S. vision for the region, that is, a constellation of nations that are sovereign, strong, and satellites to none. And since the President's announcement in 2017, we have mobilized the entire United States government to begin to bring this vision to fruition. And so the U.S. Indo-Pacific vision is built upon principles that are widely shared throughout the region, namely, ensuring the freedom of the seas and the skies, insulating sovereign nations from external coercion, promoting market-based economies, promoting open investment environments, creating fair and reciprocal trade, and supporting good governance and respect for individual rights. Now, the United States is committed to fulfilling our Indo-Pacific vision through expanding engagement with all countries of the region in 3 vital areas: economics, governance, and society. Today, I am here to address the economic pillar of this Indo-Pacific vision and to provide you with some updates on how we're doing. Cooperation with partner countries and regional institutions such as ASEAN and APEC is at the heart of our strategy. Support for ASEAN centrality is a cornerstone of our Indo-Pacific strategy. As Secretary Pompeo said at the first Indo-Pacific Business Forum, quote, ASEAN is literally at the center of the Indo-Pacific, and it plays a central role in the Indo-Pacific vision that America is presenting. APEC is also a foundation of this economic pillar of our Indo-Pacific vision. Through APEC, we level the playing field for U.S. businesses by facilitating transparent and efficient cross-border trade procedures. We strengthen policies to improve the business environment and create economic opportunity. And we are advancing free and fair trade and investment practices. APEC's 21 economies from both sides of the Pacific account for 38% of the global population, 48% of global trade, and 60% of global GDP. In fact, 6 of the United States' top 10 export partners are APEC economies that purchase 60% of U.S. goods export, supporting 6 million American jobs. APEC promotes an inclusive, rules-based regional economic architecture that supports free and open trade and investment. And since its inception in 1989, APEC total trade in goods and services has increased more than 6.7 times to $20 trillion per year, outpacing trade growth in the rest of the world, with average tariffs falling from 17% to 5.6% as recently as 5 years ago. And as an APEC member and as an APEC leader, the United States works to shape the policy environment for free and fair trade in the region and to promote high standards that will be part of future trade agreements. And we remain committed to expanding and deepening economic ties in APEC because of the benefits to the American people and our partners in the region. And this strategy of ours in the Indo-Pacific is inclusive. Secretary Pompeo has said this multiple times. Our Indo-Pacific vision excludes no nation. We seek to work with anyone to promote a free and open Indo-Pacific, so long as that cooperation adheres to the highest standards that our citizens demand. Now, the Indo-Pacific is not a concept unique to the United States, and it is one that is shared by many nations in the region, not least Japan. Though our respective visions may differ somewhat, our Indo-Pacific strategy and those of our allies and partners are complementary and are similarly guided by a commitment to uphold a rules-based order in the region. By our calculation, developing countries in the Indo-Pacific need $1.7 trillion in infrastructure investment every year, and no single government has the resources to support this strong need, which is why our strategy is to create the conditions needed to unlock private sector investment to meet this infrastructure need. According to the firm BlackRock, more than $70 trillion is stockpiled in the world's financial centers, looking for investable opportunities. We believe that our Indo-Pacific economic vision can bridge this gap between infrastructure investment needs and this capital that's currently available. We believe that our private sector is one of our biggest strengths, and no one invests more in the Indo-Pacific than U.S. businesses. U.S. foreign direct investment in the Indo-Pacific doubled from 2007 to 2017, reaching $940 billion. In 2016, United States direct investment in the Indo-Pacific supported 5.1 million jobs in that region. And we are not alone in our focus on the private sector. We believe that the greater the embrace of the private sector, the greater the economic growth. And look at the opposite, though. State-dominated, state-directed investment results in corruption, unevenly distributed economic growth, and ultimately public backlash. So based on consultations with our allies and our partners, we've identified several areas, namely digital economy, infrastructure, and energy, as target sectors for development. And today, I'll briefly discuss the progress we've made in the areas of infrastructure and energy. So one of the economic elements of this Indo-Pacific economic vision is Asia EDGE, which stands for Enhancing Development and Growth Through Energy. Asia EDGE is a whole of U.S. government effort to grow sustainable and secure energy markets throughout the Indo-Pacific region. This Asia EDGE program of the United States seeks to strengthen the energy security of allies and partners, create open, efficient, rules-based, and transparent energy markets, improve free, fair, and reciprocal energy trading relationships, and expand access to affordable and reliable energy throughout the Indo-Pacific region. So in practical terms, Asia EDGE provides technical assistance to improve our partner countries' regulatory environments and energy-related procurement processes. Asia EDGE works with partners to develop national and regional energy market plans. Asia Edge uses development finance to encourage the deployment of private capital, and Asia Edge helps countries to develop smart grids and other forms of modern energy infrastructure. In addition to Asia Edge, another element of our Indo-Pacific Vision's economic pillar is ITAN, ITAN, which stands for the Infrastructure, Transaction, and Assistance Network. And like Asia Edge, ITAN is a whole-of-government initiative to develop high-quality and financially sustainable infrastructure throughout the Indo-Pacific region. The ITAN initiative establishes a new U.S. government interagency body, coordinated by the National Economic Council, to optimize U.S. tools for assessing projects, directing development finance, and deploying technical assistance to strengthen infrastructure planning and procurement in our partner countries. ITAN has also established a new transaction advisory fund to help partner countries access private, legal, and procurement support for infrastructure negotiations and development. So we've got these new mechanisms in place. What have they done? Well, first, for Asia Edge, one recent success was in November 2018, Vice President Pence, along with the Prime Ministers of Australia, Japan, New Zealand, and Papua New Guinea, signed a joint statement and announced the Papua New Guinea Electrification Partnership to meet the electricity infrastructure development needs of the people of Papua New Guinea while avoiding unsustainable debt burdens. And since then, we've undertaken a significant collaborative scoping mission that has identified specific projects which are already improving Papua New Guinea's access to electricity. Next door in Indonesia, the United States Agency for International Development has partnered with Indonesia's state electric company in its efforts to modernize their power grids and diversify Indonesia's energy sources. In Vietnam, the Department of State and the U.S. Agency for International Development are working with the government of Vietnam to implement Vietnam's power development plan to attract private sector investment. In both Vietnam and the Philippines as well, the Department of State is providing legal assistance in employing international best practices in legal and regulatory regimes for importing LNG, an increasingly important export for the United States. In ASEAN, we're partnering with the ASEAN Council on Petroleum to exchange information on natural gas infrastructure and markets, laying the groundwork for greater U.S. exports of LNG to the region. Now, as I said, we're not alone in pursuing these efforts, and Japan is one of our most important partners. And Japan has aligned $10 billion in financing to work with Asia Edge to stimulate investment in U.S.-Japan private sector energy projects in the United Arab Emirates, Taiwan, Mozambique, and Indonesia. And we've also aligned Japan's energy capacity building efforts with Asia Edge in activities such as liquefied natural gas value chain and procurement training throughout Southeast Asia. Now, in regards to our ITAN efforts, in South Asia, the United States has expanded a regional technical assistance program that is developing transparent legal and procedural frameworks to oversee complex infrastructure contracts. And the Transaction Advisory Fund I mentioned earlier is launched and will provide transaction-specific advisory services to countries to build their capacity to assess potential infrastructure projects, including legal services and technical assistance for contract negotiations. In the Philippines, the United States has increased technical assistance to support that country and its ambitious infrastructure strategy, which President Duterte has called Build, Build, Build. Now, to enhance further our government's ability to promote private sector-led development globally, and especially in the Indo-Pacific, Congress, for which we're very grateful, passed last year an act known as the Better Utilization of Investments Leading to Development Act. It's a mouthful, but it's also known as the BUILD Act. And Congress took the lead on this, and President Trump signed it into law last October. And it's a very significant piece of legislation, very significant new mechanism for the U.S. government, really which serves to consolidate, modernize, and reform the U.S. government's development finance capabilities, primarily OPIC, the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, as well as USAID's Development Credit Authority. And these are going to be formed and merged into one organization known as the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation, or DFC for short. And this expansion of the U.S. toolkit to mobilize private sector investment, we believe, will fuel even more growth opportunities in the Indo-Pacific. So this new Development Finance Corporation will launch October 1st of this year and will have a $60 billion investment portfolio capacity, more than double its current cap. It will also have the authority to make equity investments and will enable increased cooperation with our allies and partners to advance our shared goals. Indeed, we signed last year with Japan and with Australia an MOU in November, actually, in Tokyo. We signed with JBIC and our Australian counterparts an MOU to do trilateral development finance cooperation throughout the region, which is a significant advance and I think a significant statement about our commitment to working with our allies and our partners on important infrastructure development needs. And the DFC will also have the ability to provide technical assistance and to conduct feasibility studies, something it's never been able to do before. And this will better enable U.S. engagement at the very early stages of projects' life cycles. So in closing, let me just say that our vision for a free and open Indo-Pacific requires a long time horizon. And of course, the energy and the infrastructure initiatives which we're pursuing are long-term and require a commitment that's significant. But we believe through Asia Edge, through ITAN, through the other mechanisms that we're creating, such as the new Development Finance Corporation, we are laying the groundwork for years and years of private sector investment, U.S. public investment of our time and our energy in the Indo-Pacific. And this investment of our time, our energy, our resources, both from the U.S. government and from the private sector, we believe will support U.S. exports and jobs. It will strengthen our alliances and our partnerships throughout the region, and it will create a constellation of strong, independent nations at the center of our U.S. vision for the Indo-Pacific region. So once again, thank you very much. I appreciate this opportunity, and I'm sure this is going to be a great conference. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Mark has to get back to state. We're grabbing people in their busy workday and throwing them into the line to hear their observations. Congresswoman Murphy gave, I thought, a very powerful statement on why TPP is strategically important and how she's going to do her part. And there may be some signs of hope to get us back on track. But Mark, I think, helpfully reminded us that there's a lot more to U.S. Economic engagement policies in the region, even as we sort out our larger politics on trade. So we always benefit from and enjoy at our CSIS-JETRO conferences a snapshot of what's happening in regional integration from the leader of JETRO. This year we have a new leader of JETRO. Since April 2019, Sasaki-san has been the chairman and CEO of Japan External Trade Relations Organization, JETRO, but he's not new to CSIS. We interacted with him quite a bit in his previous job from 2015 to 2019 as the senior executive vice president and corporate executive vice chairman of Fujitsu, where he led business development, public policy, thinking about the intersection of policy, business development, technology, economic integration. Before that, he did that work for Tokyo Marine. And of course, his career primarily was in the Ministry of International Trade and Industry, then Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry. A switch in name, by the way, that happened right as I was publishing a book on METI. The book went to print, and then they changed the name to METI. I want to thank you for that. It was very helpful for my sales. So he's had key positions in METI in the Trade Bureau as an advisor to the minister. Interestingly, Sasaki-san served in Beijing as the JETRO representative during some of the most interesting and politically complicated times in Japan-China relations. So Sasaki-san's going to kick off our discussion of the intersection of policy and business development with a presentation, and then we'll turn to Matt Goodman in the first panel. Sasaki-san, thank you.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to express my sincere gratitude to all of you joining us today. I would also like to give my thanks to Dr. Hamle, Dr. Green, as well as their colleagues at CSIS for their continued dedicated work on this forum. As the head of JETRO, I am pleased to be able to host such a seminar regarding the trade policy, which is one of the most politically sensitive and exciting issues at Washington, D.C. at this moment. Last October, this seminar covered the rapid progress of digital commerce within the Asia-Pacific. Experts also discussed the need to streamline the environment to facilitate the trend. Today, I'd like to follow up on this topic, and in particular, emphasize the role startups and innovation have had on growth. I'd also touch on the effects protectionism has had on this trend, as well as supply chains. And finally, we will take a look at what can be done and what is being done to allow innovation and business to thrive in the digital era. We've seen many developments since the last seminar. For example, we introduced 2 startups providing ride-sharing services in Asean. One was Grab, a company born in Malaysia, which found prosperity in Singapore. The other was Gojek in Indonesia. In less than a year, both have rapidly expanded their business categories and service areas. There's no room for Uber to operate in these 2 countries. Last November, Grab decided to invest in the leading Indonesian electric payment service provider, Lippo Group. And in Singapore, it now offers a ride-hailing service aimed at pets called Grab Pet. New business models with new technologies are also appearing in China. One example is Herma Fresh Store, a subsidiary of Alibaba, which offers courier services for fresh food. The company claims to be able to deliver anywhere within 2 miles in under 30 minutes. This is quite a bit more challenging than the 2-hour delivery by Amazon Fresh. Herma also sells products at its physical stores to allow consumers to personally verify freshness. Technologies such as big data, AI, and IoT are likely to be a game changer for business aimed at solving social problems. With large populations and developing economies, China and ASEAN are attractive markets to mount such technologies. To give an example, the retail e-commerce market in China will be expanding more rapidly than in the US. America is still unrivaled when it comes to creating new technologies from scratch. However, China and Asia increasingly excel at developing business models utilizing new technologies. What enables these startups to expand business is the flow of money. Direct investment to East Asia is strong, with flows into ventures increasing. For instance, Grab has received investment from Toyota and SoftBank, and Gojek from Google and Mitsubishi Corporation. In the meantime, companies operating in the Asia-Pacific are under greater strain due to additional tariffs imposed by the US and China, which have affected supply chains. The immediate economy of both countries appears steady thanks to stable personal consumption, but the aforementioned escalation of friction will further increase uncertainty in the business environment. JETRO's mission is assisting companies in doing international business. Our biggest concern is that changes in the trade environment will undermine predictability and legal stability. Naturally,
this has led to concerns that business expansion will decline in the region. According to research by JETRO in 2018, 75% of Japanese companies in the US have been directly or indirectly affected by protectionist measures. This result is overwhelmingly high compared to other regions, including China and Korea, where 37% of respondents are affected. If the items subject to additional tariffs increase, the scope of the impact is likely to expand. Companies are also concerned about tightening regulations on inward direct investment and export controls in the US. Since last fall, JETRO has held several seminars in Tokyo under the theme of new regulations. Within a mere few days, we received more applications than we could accommodate. I believe this is a clear sign of how heavily these issues weigh on Japanese companies. We hope for any regulations made to be enforced with high transparency. According to the US Department of Commerce, Japanese companies in the US employ more than 900,000 people. Until recently, direct investment from Japan to the US has remained steady, with employment increasing. However, there's no guarantee that the trend will hold. In fact, there have already been reported cases of companies deciding to reduce their business sites in the United States. Decoupling of supply chains may impede business activities in the US. By industry, manufacturing, including digital product, is expected to be most directly affected. Until today, manufacturers have spent years optimizing supply chains within the Asia-Pacific to stay competitive. As the chart shows, exports of digital products from China to the US has doubled over the last 10 years as a result of developing supply chains. Changes to the trade environment brought by protectionism have burdened them with unnecessary trade adjustment costs. Studies by JETRO and the American Chamber of Commerce in China reveal that many companies are already shifting supply chains from China to Vietnam, Taiwan, and Mexico. Following the decision on additional tariffs this May, this trend is expected to accelerate. Among US companies, there's also movement to avoid additional tariffs by China. To give an example, Harley-Davidson announced that it would transfer production of motorcycles aimed at China from the US to Thailand. Who bears the cost of the restructuring supply chains in the end, is the consumer of products and services. According to the team of Professor Weinstein in Columbia University, the average annual burden on each household is estimated at more than $800. This figure includes the effects of the new additional tariffs announced last month. At the same time, the competitiveness of companies in the US which procure from China will decline. As expressed up until now, leveraging tariffs as a weapon or tool in bilateral negotiations will, in the end, neither benefit the US economy nor US citizens. I mentioned startups and the innovation field at the beginning. How will change in the trade environment impact this field? If current condition continues, companies and financial institutions will be inclined toward risk aversion. As a result, growth funds in the market may be impaired. This would also adversely affect the innovation environment. likely forcing startups to drastically review their growth strategies. In the US and Japan, and across the Asia-Pacific, the role of innovation and technology in economic growth is predominantly recognized. However, the conditions necessary for them are at risk of falling apart. In order to maximize social welfare through innovation, it is necessary for us to come together to share knowledge. In addition to these environmental changes, the structure of industry itself has been shifting. Where we used to see a closed digital world, we are now seeing cyberspace and reality merge together thanks to digital technologies such as AI and IoT. All products and services are driven by data. In this regard, you could say data is crude oil for the 21st century. We need to promote the improvement of the business environment from the perspective that data is the source of innovation. What is the role required of the United States and Japanese governments under the current environment? One answer is forming a framework for facilitating innovation to mount new products and services in society. In other words, the role of rulemaking based on de jure standards or establishing and maintaining open ecosystem. In this case, it should be done within a range that does not impede the standardization of technology born from private sector innovation. The bike-sharing business in Singapore is a straightforward example. When this service first appeared, the Singaporean government did not intervene. As a result, multiple companies were able to take part, allowing the market to spread across the country at once. However, as each company prioritized customer retention, abandoned bicycles became a social problem. The government then responded by adopting a bicycle parking standard. This has greatly alleviated the situation without hindering business. Rulemaking through government-led de jure standards grows more important in international business on a daily basis. This is because products and services are able to more easily cross-border as a result of increased innovation through ICT. There's not yet a commonly agreed upon definition of digital trade, but the OECD defines it as trade in goods or services, either digital or physical, which require the cross-border transfer of data. This includes all services offered through online platforms, online hotel reservations, ride-sharing, and music distribution. Today, a company's headquarters, production and service sites, data centers, and distribution centers are likely to be located in different countries. The ideal framework under this paradigm is not bilateral, but multilateral or plurilateral. Governments can also help by disseminating digital technology, such as big data, AI, and IoT, as quickly as possible and at low cost. All of these digital technologies are capable of significantly boosting social welfare. However, if technology and data are disproportionately accumulated in the leading platformers, the income gap will widen. This could lead to problems in maximizing social welfare. Another role of the government could be responding to externality, such as increased energy consumption or unfavorable effects on society. In order to respond to these changes and expectations, Prime Minister Abe advocated the concept of data free flow with trust at the Davos conference in January. It emphasizes that establishing trust toward the digital economy and society and promoting international data flows is necessary. In order to make it a reality, Economic Minister Seko and the Japanese government have been talking with many governments. Ahead of the G20 summit next week, the G20 ministerial meetings on trade and digital economy was held in early June. All G20 countries reached an agreement on the concept of data free flow with trust, which says that trust is the enabler of free data flows. Regarding the data and digital technologies, which will drive the economy and society in the future, we need to work together with our countries to secure interoperability despite their various views on this matter. At the same time, with the purpose of realizing an inclusive and sustainable economy and society, the establishment of trust and promotion of the free flow of data is necessary. These acknowledgements are significantly meaningful. On a related note, this January, voluntary countries within the WTO agreed to begin working on an international framework for digital trade. And in fact, preparatory discussions began this May. The following are current themes for deliberation. 1, facilitation of e-commerce, such as e-signatures and electronic verification. 2, distribution of electronic data beyond borders. 3, protection of consumers. And 4, support of developing countries. It is expected that Japan will work together with the US to strongly encourage other G20 members to join these activities through the summit in Osaka. In the Asia-Pacific, e-commerce rules have already been introduced through the TPP. They will also be included in the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or RCEP, currently in the final stage of negotiations. We eagerly welcome the US to join us in promoting the improvement of the region's business environment. In the Japan-US summit meeting held in last month, the leaders of both countries reaffirmed cooperation toward the realization of a free and open Indo-Pacific. This includes for the energy, infrastructure, and digital sectors. In the meantime, the interest of individual countries in the field of digital trade has grown more diverse. A wide variety of themes have been taken up. These include exemption of tariffs, free flow of data, data localization, privacy, 5G, governance, AI, big data, regulations on platforms, and e-commerce. Based on the idea of the data free flow with trust, Japan wishes for the rules prescribed in the TPP to be applied in other regions as well. These cover areas such as 1, exempting electronic transmissions from taxation. 2, cross-border transfer of data. 3, banning mandatory data localization. And 4, non-disclosure of source codes. While focused on privacy protection and security, it also advocates rulemaking with a high level of liberalization in other matters. With ongoing discussion through the Japan-United States Strategic Digital Economy Partnership launched this March, we believe that the US shares the same orientation. In discussing development in the Asia-Pacific, economic and social infrastructure, including for energy, is vital. In particular, within Asia, the economic growth of many regions is impeded due to insufficient infrastructure. Making the benefits of innovation widely available requires developing the communication infrastructure necessary to use new technologies. One problem anticipated in the broad use of big data and 5G technology is a significant increase in power consumption. Strengthening the regional power generation capacity is therefore a pressing matter. In this light, infrastructure development is vital to maximize the economic and social potential within the Asia-Pacific. As was discussed at the previous seminar, Japan and the US should play a leading role in maintaining and strengthening the global free trade system. A cooperation such as through the trilateral meeting of the trade ministers of the US, Japan, and the EU is critical in addressing WTO reform and unfair trade practices. Where should the US and Japan focus when working to solve the issues I just mentioned? The Asia-Pacific accounts for a significant portion of the world's economy, the scale and potential. Streamlining the digital business environment in the region early on would therefore greatly develop its social economy and strengthen the competitiveness of its industries. In order for our countries to enjoy these benefits, we must take the lead in establishing a regional framework. We have been helping promote the APEC cross-border privacy rules CBPR system through holding workshops and events in the Asia-Pacific. In addition, we are also cooperating to provide capacity-building training programs. Looking at each Asia-Pacific country, we see significant differences in digital trade-related environments, as well as areas of concern. Improving the business environment will require the US and Japan to work together through demonstrating leaderships and formulating a roadmap. Regarding the relationship with Asia in particular, a mutual understanding and dissemination of information are critical to improving the business environment. JETRO is already prepared to play a contributing role here. Well then, through what framework should we engage in dialogue? What issues should take priority as we work together on digital trade and rulemaking? In the long run, forming rules through the WTO would of course be preferable. However, it is important for us to deepen discussions and mutual understanding through multiple frameworks for the time being. Further, this should be done from a holistic viewpoint, taking account the circumstances of individual countries. On this topic, I have high hopes for the following panel discussions with experts and from each country. Finally, as I mentioned earlier, the US and Japan are working together at rulemaking at this year's G20. Going forward, we will hopefully see the formation of projects in which our countries can cooperate in the field of digital-related infrastructure. I'm eager to hear insight on this point from each of the panelists today. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, let me join Mike Green in welcoming you all here. I'm Matthew Goodman. I hold the Simon Chair in Political Economy here at CSIS, and delighted to be part of this great conference again. Well, Sasaki-san, you laid quite a smorgasbord out there of important topics. My Japanese insecurities include never having quite figured out how to say smorgasbord really in Japanese, but apparently you use the word Viking, often the Viking set, which I like because it suggests that there's an opportunity to plunder the food selection that you put on the table. So we're going to try to do that in this panel and select some tasty items to talk about. There's way too much to really cover everything, but we're going to do this in 3 parts this session. First, we're going to have presentations from the 3 experts. Then we're going to, the other 2/3 of the conversation is going to involve you, because we're going to use these clickers to allow you to vote on different questions, which we're going to put up on the screen in the second part. And then we'll do questions and answers with you about any of the above topics. So this is, as Mike said, the 14th time we've done this forum, and I've been involved with it actually even before I joined CSIS 7 years ago. I think I spoke at this once upon a time. And as Mike said, until this year, really, the focus has always been on, how do we integrate more deeply? Why should we integrate more deeply? What are the policy tools? And we've typically had, a question about, is RCEP winning or is TPP winning? And we will have a question about that later. But this time, as Mike said, we're really in a different environment, and I think that, and Sasaki-san implied it as well, that we're in a new environment where you have a very different trade approach from the United States in the region, in the Asia-Pacific region. We have this trade war, let's call it, between the U.S. and China going on, which is leading down paths that we didn't think were really possible, again, even a year ago. We have the U.S. out of TPP. We have tariffs and other threats against allies. We have the U.S. pulling out GSP benefits from India. And so, there's a very different environment policy-wise, and I think that is raising questions, as Sasaki-san said, about trade patterns, supply chains, investment decisions in the region. And so I think this conversation is going to be quite different, at least this first part of the conversation. As I say, we will ask about those traditional policy tools and things, but I think that's the fundamental backdrop here. And the question to me is, are we experiencing a permanent change, or is this something temporary that's going to correct when some of the policy issues maybe get resolved? I mean, for example, just to be provocative, supposing President Trump and President Xi Jinping shake hands on a deal the end of next week in Osaka at the G20. I think it's unlikely, but it's possible. It wouldn't be the first time that President Trump has agreed to a deal, surprisingly, most analysts. So, if that happens, does that mean that we're back in the old world and next year's conference can be back on the sort of traditional track, or are we in a very different, sort of permanent structural change here about patterns of integration and trade investment flows in the region? So that, to me, is the fundamental question here. We have a fantastic panel here, as always, a great group of experts from the region. So I'm going to introduce them now and let them go one by one, and we're going to do it, I think, in this order. So the first speaker is Professor Tu Xin Chuan who is the professor. He's dean and professor at the Center for WTO Studies at Beijing's University of International Business and Economics. His research focuses on Chinese trade policy, the WTO, government procurement, U.S. trade policy, and U.S.-China trade relations. He served on the WTO Secretariat as a visiting researcher, and here at CSIS, Mike's in my alma mater, and at Icp as well, I see, the Korea Institute for International Economic Policy. Got his PhD in International Trade and Master of Arts in International Trade from the university that he now is teaching at. Next to him is Yasuyuki Todo, who is professor at Waseda University's Graduate School of Economics. From 2010 to 14, he was professor at the University of Tokyo's Associate Graduate School of Frontier Sciences. His recent research focuses on the impact of firm networks, supply chain, shareholding links, research collaboration on economic activity using firm-level data from various countries in Asia and Africa. He received his PhD in economics and Master of Arts in food research, interestingly, from Stanford University, and a Bachelor of Arts from the University of Tokyo. And next to me is Deborah Elms, who is founder and executive director of the Asian Trade Center in Singapore, which works with governments and companies to design better trade policies for the region. She's the vice chair of the Asia Business Trade Association, sits on the International Technical Advisory Committee of the Global Trade Professionals Alliance, and many other, she works with many other organizations, has a big focus on TPP, on Asean, and other regional initiatives. She got her PhD in political science from the University of Washington and MA from the University of Southern California. And Deborah is representing the ASEAN or perspective. We usually have a scholar from Vietnam or Singapore or one of the ASEAN countries, but we're delighted to have Deborah stand in. She's based in Singapore, so she can hopefully speak to some of those perspectives. So I've talked enough. With that, Professor Tu.
Thank you, JETRO and CSIS for inviting me here. I'm always glad to come back, although the atmosphere is not so good as before. Actually, I've prepared a PPT, but I won't follow it rigidly because of time limit. I would like to just make some brief points. The first point is that China is on the defensive side in this US-China trade war. We are really shocked and surprised and not prepared at all for what the US government has done to us. We did not expect that the US government would be so determined and courageous to obviously break the rules and trade connections promoted by the US for decades. Our early assessment was that a wide range of additional tariffs are impossible because they are clearly against WTO rules and will significantly hurt US economic interests. But it turned out that the US government does not care about them at all. We are also shocked by the fact that tariffs are not a means to make things right, to push forward China's faster and deeper opening up and reform, but a purpose itself, to partially cut the economic interdependence between the two countries. We thought Section 301 is a kind of deterrent weapon to force partners to make concessions. But the outcome is that the US administration really believes that tariffs will benefit US interests. Even worse is trade war is not only about trade, but a part of wider strategy of containing China. China has been demonized as the main sinner responsible for various domestic problems in the US and the key challenge of US-led international order. We totally underestimated the fundamental changes in the US policymaking circle. The director of Institute of American Studies in CAS, China Academy of Social Sciences, has lost his visa to the US, perhaps due to the alleged wide information collection activities. But in China, actually, people, even including himself, Mr. Wu, are blaming these American research institutions and researchers for their misinformation and misunderstanding about US actions. Therefore, China's responses and reactions have been largely hasty and not well conceived. Especially at the beginning, in the year of 2017 and early 2018, we thought that the old ways of dialogue and purchase offers would work to stabilize the relationship. But now we have realized that no matter what we do, the US government would not be satisfied anyway. In response to this aggressive and hostile actions of the US government, we have to defend our national interest and dignity with tit-for-tat reactions. One thing I should emphasize is that within China, there was a consensus that tougher US pressure is necessary and beneficial for accelerating China's opening up and reform, especially among Chinese academics, there was wide disappointment about the slow implementation of reform agenda made in the third plenum of the 18th Party Congress. Then the long-admired benevolent hegemon of the United States was expected to play a positive role to promote such a process. However, an even larger disappointment for us is that the US government seems not only unsatisfied with China's policy and the system, but also hostile to China as a nation. Now, though many people are still not supportive of retaliatory policies, the mainstream question in China is that what choice do we have? We have to fight back. The second point is, with this background of deterioration of US-China relations, the relations with other regions, especially Asia-Pacific, have gained more attention of the Chinese government. One result of the trade war is ASEAN has replaced the US as the second largest trading partner of China in the first 5 months of this year. Actually, I think the US is a part of Asia-Pacific community. Now, of course, the term has become Indo-Pacific. Indo-Pacific, right? Okay. Anyway, I'm not sure about the difference between the two terms. The whole region has been closely integrated in the last decades. I'm sorry, I should move on this. Sorry, I forgot it. I think, yeah, anyway. You can have a look at the chart. The US and China are two centers in the Asia-Pacific value chains, making their respective contributions. But it is no doubt that China now has a greater role as a production hub in the regional economic independence, while the US is largely a final consumer. No country is willing to take a side between China and the US, and China does not want it to be isolated, of course. So we need to further engage in regional integration through various bilateral and regional initiatives such as China-Japan-Korea FTA and Icp. RCEP is certainly the lowest hanging fruit in front of China. Though it is not so high quality and comprehensive, it should still be celebrated as a victory in the tide of deglobalization. The Chinese government seems very determined to promote the conclusion before the end of this year. Another option getting more attention is to join the CPTPP. It is not, I think it is not on the table of the government yet, whose first priority is to finish RCEP as soon as possible. But among Chinese academics and the reformists in the government, CPTPP is considered the best choice to promote domestic reform and to break through US encirclement. Then the third point is the more important thing for China is to make ourselves better. It is almost impossible, I think, for China to influence domestic politics within the US. I think even US business community has difficulty with this. A few Chinese people actually in China believe that we have reached a kind of an ideal point of so-called China model. China's system has some advantages such as mobilizing and accumulating resources quickly and efficiently, but we are not so good at stimulating individual initiative and motivation by offering citizens more autonomy and protection. We still believe that economic reform, market-oriented economic reform and opening up could play a positive role in terms of social and political progress. Until now, a significant shortcoming of China's FTA strategy is unwilling to make more institutional changes rather than market access commitments. This requires a deeper integration rules and more powerful negotiating partners. It is, I think, a good time now for Asian partners to request tougher institutional commitments since China is in urgent need of friends. On the China side, actions speak louder than words. History tells us that difficult reforms always happen in difficult times. Now the Chinese government has started to take serious actions on opening up more services industries, reforming subsidies, and reducing tariffs further. The final point I would like to make is that I think now is the right time to seriously consider or reconsider the framework of G2. Both China and the US should be regulated by a set of rules bilaterally negotiated and globally accepted. This does not mean that the two countries will dominate world affairs, but without a certain and well-managed US-China relationship, the whole world will suffer. And actually, the world is suffering right now. And the world is also expecting a stable and predictable US-China relationship. Maybe when we look back, it was premature and maybe too early in 2008 and 2009 to advocate such an idea. But now I think China has had the will and ambition to take more responsibility as a world leader, and also realize that the urgency to establish a balanced power structure between China and the US. I'm going to stop here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Tu, and really for your frank comments, and I think important to give that perspective from China, and want to talk about that. And I think your idea of effectively some kind of G2 a deal to then be the basis for an international understanding is powerful. So we'll talk about that. Thank you very much, Professor Tu. Professor Toto.
Thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to thank CSIS and JETRO for inviting me to this very great conference. It is my great honor. I'm an international economist or development economist, focusing on social and economic networks, the role of social and economic networks in economic growth and resilience. And today, in this presentation, I'd like to mention three concerns related to Asia-Pacific economic integration. First is propagation of economic shocks through international supply chains. Second, insufficient knowledge integration. And finally, excessive protectionism. So everyone knows that the Asia-Pacific region has been well integrated through international supply chains or production networks. But this is associated with a disadvantage because negative economic shocks can propagate through supply chains. These figures are taken from one of my studies examining how production reduction due to the 2011 Japan earthquake propagated to regions that were not directly hit by the earthquake. So it is clear that an economic shock can identify. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, this one. Yeah. So these figures are showing propagation of negative shocks. I think I should look at this slide. And that means an economic shock can indirectly affect firms in the entire economy through supply chains. This actually implies that regulations on Huawei's production, for example, may lead to large indirect effects on the whole Asia-Pacific region. Okay, and but this propagation can be mitigated. I conducted another study focusing on the propagation of negative shocks by Hurricane Sandy's in the U.S. In 2012. And this figure simply shows that U.S. firms linked with a firm damaged by the hurricane reduced sales after the hurricane very much, like almost 20%. However, this negative effect did not reach non-U.S. firms or U.S. firms with foreign partners that were linked with the damaged firm by the hurricane. So the implication is that if you have foreign partners Or if you, more generally, if you are diversifying partners, then you can promote, you can mitigate the economic shocks. So this can lead to economic resilience. So in other words, too much reliance on a limited number of partners may incur risks. So next, let's talk about knowledge, because creation of knowledge or innovation is the ultimate source of economic growth, as emphasized by Professor Paul Romer, who got a Nobel Prize last year. I would like to note this because Professor Romer was my co-advisor at Stanford, so he's my hero. And so this figure simply shows that most of the new ideas are generating in the Asia-Pacific region. However, the Asia-Pacific region is not well integrated in terms of production of knowledge. So this figure is taken from one of my studies, shows research collaboration networks among firms. So for example, red dots indicate Japanese firms, blue US firms, and purple Chinese firms. You can easily see that from this figure, the US firms, Chinese firms, and European firms are well integrated, conducting research collaboration a lot. However, Japanese firms and South Korean firms are quite segregated with few collaboration. This is quite bad because international research collaboration has been found to be very effective to promote innovation and economic growth. So this figure shows that the effect of international collaboration on the innovation quality measured by the number of patent citations is 30% for the US and more than 100% for China. And this effect is a lot larger than the effect of domestic collaboration. So it is clear that China actually benefits a lot from links with the US, but at the same time, the US also benefits from foreign collaborators. Okay? So I would suggest that knowledge networks should be promoted much more in the Asia-Pacific region. And the knowledge networks are not restricted to research collaboration. It should include, for example, technology transfer through supply chains and overseas studies by students. However, I would like to emphasize that rules should be clearly set to promote economic growth, to promote knowledge network. That means, for example, we should strengthen intellectual property rights in particular. Finally, protectionism. So everyone knows that protectionist sentiment has been rising in developed countries. This figure shows that about 1/3 of US citizens think that international trade creates jobs. In the case of Japan, only 20%. That means 80% of Japanese are very much skeptical about the benefits of globalization. But that's actually too much, right? I believe that a lot more than 20% of Japanese benefiting from globalization. So actually in the early 2010s, many Japanese were against TPP, including farmers and also workers or citizens in general. For example, medical doctors and nurses were strongly against the TPP, fearing that universal health insurance in Japan would be destroyed by US insurance companies. So this means that economic loss from globalization alone cannot explain the rise of protectionism. So this implies that we need a behavioral economics approach. No, I'm sorry, I skipped one slide. So why? Because we started from here. So 100,000 years ago, we actually formed small groups to fight against other groups and other species. So this implies that we may be intrinsically closed and hostile to outsiders. So to alleviate this problem, we need to take a behavioral economics approach. Right. As Professor Heckman, another Nobel laureate, emphasizes. So he actually found that education, particularly to children, can improve non-cognitive skills. And also another study by some Japanese scholars using a survey to 10,000 Japanese found that when Japanese were engaged in group works, the group activities in their childhood, such as team sports, community activities, and group works, then they were more likely to have a higher level of non-cognitive skills measured by, for example, pro-competition, trusting others. And then they are more likely to support the TPP. So this implies that social interactions can actually change the intrinsically close nature of human beings. So probably excessive protectionism may stem from intrinsically close nature of human beings, and thus claiming only economic benefits may not lead to consensus in terms of economic integration. So social interactions should be promoted to alleviate protectionism. So I would like to emphasize the role of overseas experiences of politicians, bureaucrats, business persons, and students. In this regard, I would like to thank CSIS for accommodating many Japanese politicians, bureaucrats, and business persons. And also I'd like to thank JETRO for promoting internationalization of Japanese firms. Final remark. So in the 1930s, actually many countries raised tariff rates. And this led to bloc economies and finally to World War II. But in this period, the US did not raise tariff rates too much. Okay, so I hope this time again, the US will protect free trade and prevent decoupling. And this time, actually, I hope Japan, unlike last time, will also play an important role in preventing decoupling. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Todo. Well, I was going to say that I think you win the prize for the most artistic chart that I think we've ever had in a CSIS presentation. That research collaboration thing looks like a Jackson Pollock painting or something. It's fantastic. But then the caveman one might have trumped that. So fantastic. Huh? Sorry? Vote on it. All right, we'll have a clicker question about that later. But seriously, really thought-provoking and taking us in a rather different direction than I think any speaker has before in this conference, and so really interesting. And I have a question to you about this, the research piece of this. With that, Deborah.
Okay. No. Thank you very much. I am delighted to be here this morning. I'm talking about ASEAN. I've been in ASEAN now for 15 years. And have been working with ASEAN companies and Asian companies more broadly. And so I was asked to discuss how the U.S.-China issue in particular, or U.S. policy, is affecting Southeast Asia and Asia more broadly. So I'm going to go, I have a bunch of slides, and I'm going to do something I really hate, which is put slides up and then flip through them without actually spending time on them, which I personally dislike, and I apologize for doing that, but time constraints being what they are, here they are. So you can probably get the slides. I assume you're going to put them up or something. Up, so yeah. Good. They're up. You can look at them at your leisure. So let me go through them kind of quickly. So just for those of you who don't remember where ASEAN is, there are 10 countries in ASEAN in Southeast Asia. There they are, the 10 of them. It's complicated. This trade war is complicated for ASEAN, and it's one of those good news, bad news stories. Many folks in ASEAN, and especially many political leaders in ASEAN, will tell you that they will win out of the trade war. And so, you know, while no one really wants a trade war, frankly, the ASEAN countries are secretly very gleeful that this is happening because they think that they will benefit. And for some countries and some sectors, the answer is they may. But for others, the damage is high. I mean, really, nobody wins much out of a trade war. And so part of the challenge in ASEAN, it's already a diverse region, and the implications of this trade conflict in this diverse region is mixed. So we have some winners, some losers, some sectors doing well, some that are not. And it's very, very complicated. And one of the reasons why ASEAN, I would argue, is not doing as well as it could be doing is because ASEAN itself has never successfully gotten past its own soaring rhetoric to deliver on-the-ground results, nor have its individual members done what they could. If we had the actual rhetoric coming closer to reality, and ASEAN were, in fact, an integrated region of 600 million people with a free flow of goods, services, investment, skilled labor, and freer movement of capital, which is the headline thing for the ASEAN economic community, then ASEAN would be very well poised to do well out of this economic mess that we are finding ourselves in. But since they haven't, the story is a little less bright than you might think. So ASEAN has always been at the forefront of integration. They've been at this for a very long period of time. The ASEAN themselves have now moved to the ASEAN Economic Blueprint 2025. They've also got six what they call ASEAN Plus One agreements. The sixth one, maybe you weren't paying attention, we almost missed it actually. ASEAN Hong Kong just came online with 5 of the members of ASEAN last week. So we have these ongoing initiatives in ASEAN and with the neighbors to continue to integrate. So while we have chaos emanating from here, we have integration happening in Asia, and I think that's important. The other thing, which I'll talk about in a little bit more detail, of course, is the RCEP negotiations. But don't forget as well that the Europeans are extremely active in Asia, and especially in Southeast Asia, where we have EU-Japan already in force, EU-Singapore, any minute now it will finally be locked in. It's taken forever, but it's really close now. EU-Vietnam is finished, and we're waiting for the final ratification. They are restarting they're in the middle of negotiations with Indonesia. I personally think that's a job security job, but whatever. The Malaysians and the Philippines may be restarting relatively soon. So the European Union continues to move ahead with integration in Europe, in ASEAN. Let me talk briefly then about RCEP and where we're at with RCEP. I know RCEP is treated very skeptically in this town, which is with some good reason, but I think you are too dismissive in Washington of RCEP. We're in the 29th round of RCEP, so I realize that that's part of the reason for such skepticism, and as someone who has hiked around with RCEP now, this will be the 18th time that I've been to RCEP. I am joining your skepticism, and I'm exhausted, and I hope we finish. But RCEP, it's complicated. You know, we have 16 countries now in RCEP, all 10 members of ASEAN, China, Japan, Korea, India, Australia, New Zealand. That is a complicated thing to try to slot together and get to conclusion. I mean, TPP was bad, but TPP, at least everybody was voluntarily at the table. So when you're voluntarily there, you want an outcome, even if it's difficult to finally get done. In RCEP, everyone was drafted. You are in RCEP because you are a member of ASEAN or because you have an existing ASEAN Plus One agreement. So not everyone is equally enthusiastic at sitting down in the first place. So you can imagine how complicated this is to get the agreement locked in. And in particular, what's been hard is getting what they call the ASEAN dialogue partners, China, Japan, Korea, India, Australia, and New Zealand, to commit to opening. Because this will be the first time that many of those dialogue partners, particularly India, China, have an agreement together. And that is proving to be really difficult to get across the line. So it's an interesting agreement, and it's one that we should pay more attention to because it will link together Asia in a way that we have not seen before. So we will have one agreement that covers 16 countries in Asia. And even if it's relatively modest at the outset, it will upgrade over time. So even if the tariff cuts are relatively modest to start in some places, they will be improved over time. Now, fingers crossed that they don't wreck this agreement with bad rules of origin, which is a big problem. We're trying to fix that. But nonetheless, tariff cuts coming, ability to move goods, especially all around 16 countries in Asia, this is something that people should be paying attention to. It also includes more than that. So it's a comprehensive agreement. It's goods, it's services, it's investment, it's intellectual property rights, it's e-commerce, it's got a legal chapter, which I don't know that they will use, but it will have one. So there's a lot of things in this agreement. And getting it done is going to be complicated, but we expect to have it done this year. And the reason we expect to have it done, I know you're all saying, oh, I've heard this before. No, this year is pretty serious, because if we don't get it done this year, then it's difficult to see how it keeps going. So what they may do is default to an ASEAN +3 if they don't get it done this year, and kick out India, Australia, and New Zealand. Kick them out for different reasons. The Indians, because they're difficult at the bottom end, and Australia, New Zealand, because they're difficult in being too ambitious. And so if you kick them all out, you could get the agreement done and be done by this week, potentially, end of this month. And so that may happen, or alternatively, just get the whole thing finished. We know what the issues are. They've been the same issues from the beginning. And so I think that's important. The second thing that I want to mention briefly is CPTPP, which has been mentioned earlier, but just be aware, again, it's in force. And I'm going to skip over a lot of this, but it's in force now for 2 of the ASEAN countries. 4 of them are in, 2 of them are in force, Singapore and Vietnam. We're already seeing benefits for especially Vietnam. So if you start looking at the Vietnamese numbers, especially things like Vietnam-Canada, which did not exist before, you can see the uptick in Vietnam-Canada numbers that you did not have. So that is also very interesting and important to pay attention to. I'm going to skip over the CPTPP because you know what this is. Just to show you that the Vietnamese numbers, this is a slightly confusing chart, but basically to show you that Vietnam's exports month by month compared 2017, 18, 19, January, February, March, because we've only been in force now since January, the numbers are exploding. And then to compare that to U.S. imports from Vietnam, also changing as a result of the trade war, but you can see that the numbers in Canada, they're small, but the proportion is very, very high. In other words, the Canadian exports out of Vietnam really exploding, partly because the Vietnamese and the Canadians have done an amazing job of taking advantage of this. And then finally, let me just mention that, of course, the U.S.-China trade war has really significant impacts for ASEAN. Not as much, though, as people expect, at least not yet. And the reason for that is because supply chains are much stickier than people seem to expect. I think if you haven't worked in companies, maybe you missed this point. It is not so easy to just pack up and move a factory. I might move my factory, but getting all of the ancillary services that I need to make my factory be successful is harder than you think. And even the most advanced global MNCs are reluctant to move factories when they're not certain how long this is going to last, when they're not certain whether this matters to them. Even a 25% tariff increase, which is big, is just another disruption in your supply chain. They deal with these kinds of things all the time. So if we look at the numbers, early on, ASEAN was going to be in trouble. All the pink boxes are Asian inputs into China that then go to the U.S. So you can see that Asia is tightly tied into these supply chains, and especially Southeast Asia. So any disruption in that trade is really problematic for ASEAN. And deeply problematic for countries like Singapore, where Singapore's semiconductor exports in particular are a huge part of Singapore's export bucket altogether. And you can see, of course, we're shifting supply chains, but let me just finish with my last chart here. Here it is. If you just look at the supply chain indexes, especially coming out of China, actually the numbers are not as bad as people expect. So many people say, oh, trade disruptive, total disaster, things are a mess. If you look at the shipping rates and shipping freight indexes and so forth, and part of what we do at the Asian Trade Center is help people shift supply chains, and if you look at the actual supply chain indices and shipping container numbers, they're not as bad as you would expect, and especially the red lines are this year and the other lines are from 2015 forward. You can see that while we have disruption, it's not nearly as bad as disruption other times, because supply chains are used to dealing with disruption. There's a hurricane here, a volcano there, a flood somewhere else, a currency fluctuation somewhere. I mean, this is not an abnormal thing, even though, of course, we're not used to having tariffs go from 0 to 25%, and certainly not in the United States. So the point is just that supply chains are moving, but not as fast as people think, and not in the ways that people might expect. The longer this goes on, though, the more they will shift. They may shift to ASEAN, they may shift out of ASEAN, and in particular, my last point to this audience would be a bit careful, because they may shift to Asia full stop. into Asia for an Asian market, rather than shifting into Asia for a U.S. final market. People may say, screw it, this is too complicated, I'm not in the mood. If I'm going to shift my supply chain, I'm going to shift it for the long run, and in the long run, where are my final markets likely to be? In Asia. 4 billion consumers in Asia, many of them a growing middle class. The middle class in China is bigger now than the entire U.S. itself. So, for a company, if I'm going to go through the aggravation of shifting up my supply chain, I should think about the future, and maybe the future is not the way that it has been in the past. Maybe the future is something entirely different. So let me just leave it at that. Thanks.
Okay, fantastic. That was another great presentation. Thank you. And great food for thought. Let me ask one question each. I think we have enough time for me to ask a quick question of each panelist, and then we're going to do the clickers, and then you'll have a chance to join in as well. But just starting with you, Deborah. So if you're Vietnam and you've seen, I think in the first 4 months of this year, Chinese investment in Vietnam has increased nearly 6-fold. As a result of some of these forces. You've got trade creation, trade diversion effects, some short-term benefit, but not clear where this is going to go long-term. What do you do? I mean, if you're Vietnam, how do you position yourself in this changing environment? What is their strategy? And, or other ASEAN countries as well, but Vietnam seems to be right at the heart of this.
Well, Vietnam is doing, I think, the best. That's why they've got so much inbound investment. And the reason why they've done, I think, relatively well is that they have tried to get their domestic house in order, even before this current trade war. So they've said, look, we need to become, rather than the bottom of ASEAN in the CMLV basket, we need to jump to the top of ASEAN. And so in order for us to do that, we will do things like sign on to CPTPP, which is super complicated, but we'll do it anyways. And we'll make our very best efforts to comply with those rules. We'll sign on to a European Union agreement, which reinforces the domestic pressures on us to get the job done domestically. And that will help us be an attractive destination for inbound investment. And so that was already in tow before we ended up with this chaos out of here. And I think that's partly why they are doing so well out of this additional trade complication, U.S.-China, because they have the systems in place that attract inbound investment because of CPTPP, because of EU, coming up EU-Vietnam, because they are jumping to the top of the ASEAN tables in many respects. Again, it's, they were towards the bottom before, they're moving quite sharply. And I think if you're not doing that, if you're not putting your own domestic house in order, if you're doing backwards policies like making it more difficult for foreign investors, making it more difficult to export, making it more expensive, if it takes you 3 years to get a permit to build a factory, who's going to relocate to your country? If you're making it more expensive for you to ship things out, who's going to relocate to your factory? So you need to think about, if you have really backwards, like India keeps thinking they're going to do well out of this, and I don't really. If you have really backwards policies on e-commerce and digital trade, why would I go there looking to the future? I would not. So surprise, surprise, nobody's going. Why? Because the policies are backwards, difficult, and can change in an instant. This is not the kind of stable environment where an investor thinking forward wants to put down new roots for the future.
Okay, thanks. Lots more to ask about, and we'll maybe get the audience to help with this. But Professor Toto, so going back to your Jackson Pollock painting, which is spectacular, really. This research collaboration issue has exploded as a topic here in Washington in the last few months. I mean, it's been around for years, but it's become a very hot topic with a lot of conversation, including one here a couple weeks ago that we had in this room about, including with the provost from MIT and some national security experts, talking about this question of maintaining an open environment in our universities and our laboratories for research on the one hand, and the benefits that provides to us, but also, the real national security risk the risks that arise from that, from a lot of sources, but including researchers who are taking knowledge back, and sometimes it's feeding into less positive, non-commercial, and more national security worrisome areas. So getting that balance right, very difficult. Is this a conversation that's happening in Japan? And are you having a discussion in your university or in other universities about these issues? And how are you trying to strike the balance? And then related to this, what are the implications for trade and investment patterns in the region? Big questions, but if you could give us a quick answer to that.
Quick answer. First of all, in Japan, actually, it's been debating. For example, in universities too. So now, I think in the Japanese universities, if I want to invite, for example, Chinese scholars, I have to, write many papers to get approval. This actually hinders research collaboration, I think. And I think, again, innovation is very important, and research collaboration is a very important channel of knowledge diffusion, which promotes innovation. Learning from your research partner is completely legal, basically. But again, I want to emphasize that we need rules, explicit rules for national security or whatever. Research collaboration should be under explicit contracts, and then the contract should be specified. So that's, I think, very important for this, to promote innovation. Thank you.
Okay, well, again, it's a huge topic and one we may invite you back to talk to us about more, because it's really of interest to us here at CSIS deeply. So, Professor Tu, your presentation was understandably somewhat dark, and often when we get to the topic of U.S.-China trade issues, we have the same conversation here with different perspectives, but ultimately it's a pretty dark conversation. Can you give us any light? Is there anything in either regional or global trading, the regional or global trading system, where there is actually an opportunity for the U.S. and China to cooperate, collaborate, to get something positive done beyond the purely bilateral issues that we're struggling over? Is there something on the international or regional agenda where the U.S. and China have a clear, aligned interest where they could work together?
Well, I'm sorry for my pessimism.
Yeah, it's understandable.
Yeah, actually, I've been always optimistic, but now, yeah, things changed. It's really difficult. I mean, actually, even multilateral discussions are based on bilateral negotiations. Like right now, actually, members, at least in the WTO, members are proposing to implement some reforms. China has delivered its proposal on WTO reform, and actually some points in the proposal are responding to U.S. requests on so-called structural reforms. So in this sense, we are cooperating, but. As a whole, for the WTO, now the key problem is the functioning of the dispute settlement mechanism. Members, including China at least, pay a lot of attention to that. We believe this is a basis for the enforceability of WTO rules. If big members don't follow rules, then why we make rules? So this is, I think, a big dilemma in the WTO reform. Now we are waiting for the proposal of the United States. The U.S. has complained about dispute settlement a lot, but has not submitted any constructive ideas about how to improve this system. I think China and other members are suspicious of the value of making new rules. even in the ongoing negotiation on electronic commerce, we also have this concern. So, I mean, we have, I think we have a lot of expectations on the United States to play, or how to say, to get back its own confidence in itself and its belief in international systems, to follow the rules made by or led by itself. So anyway, I think it largely still depends on the United States. We are looking forward to
Well, thank you for the boost of our self-confidence. I wrote about that a couple weeks ago, and I agree with you. I think a lot of this is a problem of our lack of self-confidence, and we need to restore that. So that might be a start. Okay, this is where veterans of the this forum will know that we now bring you into the conversation here. In front of you, you should have one of these very expensive, I'm going to stress, very expensive items of hardware. And I say that because if you take it out of here, someone is going to come running after you, and that we will find you. So do not take this away. These are clickers which have 5 buttons on them. Well, actually 6 buttons. The first one that's most important is to turn on the orange button at the top to turn the power on. We will then be given a series of questions on the screen, which are multiple choice questions, and you can push, that's last year's result. We should not quite yet put that up. Okay, great, if we can get full screen. So we need a question first, and we're going to have a question. You can push any one of these buttons. You can push 15 times, it won't make any difference. You'll only get 1 vote, but vote often, vote early. You'll get 1 vote. We will get results here in real time of the audience view on these issues, and then we will talk about it up here. And then later we'll have you able to ask questions as well. So does that make sense? Everybody understand? So turn on your orange button so you get a little green light at the top, and then we will put up the first question. Yuka, I think, is doing this. If we could put up the first question. There we go. Which of the following initiatives related to economic integration in the Asia-Pacific region has the greatest momentum now? CPTPP, RCEP, AEC, or BRI, Belt and Road? We'll give everybody a minute. Please do vote. By the way, these are anonymous. Nobody's going to know who voted for what. So please do vote. We always find that some people are shy, but it's okay. As usual, we always get somebody who votes for E when there is no answer E. So that's fine. There we go. We deliberately don't put up, in most of the questions, we don't put up other or, none of the above, because that's too easy. We want to force you to try to say what you think is the best answer. Okay, so it looks like we have at least a plurality here, if not I guess it is a majority, in favor of CPTPP. That's interesting. Start with you, Deborah. Why is the audience right? Is this the initiative with the most momentum right now?
So I think it depends on, I voted yes, CPTPP. We've been working on this forever, so yes. I think it depends on where you sit, though. Obviously, if you're in or potentially in a country that will or is in the CPTPP, it matters a lot to you. If you're in a country that will never join it, then obviously it matters less to you. So I think it's one of those where you stand depends on where you sit. Because if I were in a country that will never be in CPTPP, or at least not in some foreseeable future, then maybe I would vote for BRI, because I would say, well, maybe that matters more to me. But in Asia, in terms of momentum for integration, especially for the things that I assume people in this room care about, CPTPP is probably more interesting because it's more about integration. And so I think that's why people are voting for that one.
Okay. Does that surprise you, that result? Professor Tu? No? Doesn't surprise you? Okay. Belt and Road scores pretty well. We're going to have some questions about Belt and Road, so we can pause. So if you don't have comments, we can move right along to the second question. Okay, is this the second one? In 10 years, which of the following initiatives will define Asian economic integration? Same 4 initiatives. Again, your favorite choice. Don't press E, please. Come on. I'll give you another second here. Okay. All right. Again, some people are not voting because I count there are way more than 85 people in this room, which is roughly what the numbers are up there. So please don't be shy. Okay. So I'm going to ask Professor Todo, why is CPTPP scoring so well? Without the United States in it, is Japan, as it did in getting CPTPP done, going to be able to push others into the agreement, push it out further, or what do you think explains this view, or is it just skepticism about the other ones, maybe?
So first of all, I'm very happy to see this result. And I'm very happy to hear that China is already interested in joining CPTPP. And so in this question, actually, asking about Asian economic integration, not Asian Pacific integration. So I'm not sure whether U.S. is included or not. But hopefully, in the end, the U.S. will also join CPTPP. So we will have a complete RCEP-like or FTAP-like economic integration in Asia. So I'm not sure. Actually, looking from Japan, I was more, pessimistic about the CPTPP, but here it seems that, people are more supportive to TPP, which is very good news to me.
Good. Again, might be skepticism about the other ones, but and we are going to ask about BRI in a minute. But Professor Tu, can I just ask you, 10 years from now, will China be in CPTPP?
I hope so, yeah.
Prediction.
Yeah, possible, I think. Yeah,
it is possible.
Yeah, it is possible.
But seriously, it's possible, but it's got pretty high standards. I mean, on things like state-owned enterprises and some things that China would find difficult to meet today.
Yeah, but now, like, the principle of competitive neutrality is accepted by the Chinese government. So, I mean, Chinese people are always adaptive and pragmatic. So if they are really important and beneficial for us, we can adjust our principles.
Okay. All right. Deborah, did you want to?
Well, I've always found this a bizarre argument. If Vietnam can do CPTPP, then China can certainly do CPTPP. I mean, look, if it's a political will discussion, and if the Chinese government decides they're going to do it, they're going to do it, and it's not that complicated. I mean, even the SOE provisions, with all due respect to my colleagues who negotiated it, who were in the room, the SOE provisions have a giant loophole at the outset, and I would argue that as a result, I just define everything as a public good and I move ahead. And so, I mean, I think this is fixable. It's what I would argue. So I think China could absolutely come into CPTPP without necessarily wrecking the agreement as it is and add a boost to it. Now, will it be complicated? Yes. Would it be complicated for the U.S.? Of course, which is why the Chinese are thinking about it now,
Okay, I challenge the next panel to ask what the implications of that would be if China were in CPTPP 10 years from now and we're not, the United States is not. What would that mean? Okay, let's move on. Actually, just pause for a second. Do we have last year's results? I just realized that I think we had last year's results. Yeah, this is last year, so it's a similar result. We'd ask the same question. Similar, although RCEP did a little better last year. Than this year, which is interesting, because it's supposed to be the final year this year, right?
This is it.
Interesting. Well, we'll see. Every year we've been saying RCEP's going to be finished this year, right? So, okay, this is it. All right. We'll hold you to that next year. Okay, next question, please. To BRI one. Yeah, BRI is, and then you can read these. I'll give you a minute to read it. It takes a second. It's best, no, you can't do multiple answers. I know it's difficult, but you have to pick what you think is the closest to the truth. I'm going to give you an extra few seconds because it's a lot to digest there. Again, I know there are more people in this room than have voted, so please do try to vote. It helps us get a little bit more scientific response here. Okay, but there seems to be a fairly clear pattern here, though it's not a majority, a plurality feel that it is creating a new Sino-centric economic architecture, versus the other end of the spectrum, I guess, is probably C, that it's a waste of money for China, at least. So, Professor Tu, not to put you on the spot, but do you think that this is a reasonable judgment by the audience?
Well, I think BRI is beyond Asia, right? So, at least to my, even in China, BRI is still a difficult issue. It's difficult to understand. So I don't think, I'm not sure I fully understand this initiative. But to my understanding, I think BRI is more about infrastructure. So this, of course, is from China's own experience. We believe that infrastructure is critical for economic development. And China has this capability and maybe excessive capability in infrastructure building. So the Chinese government wants to, you could say, play a so-called responsible stakeholder role in the world to help other developing countries to develop their infrastructure. Of course, China has its own benefits, its own intentions, like to, especially to export more of our construction materials and equipments. But I think it's also beneficial for the countries under this initiative. But I don't think the purpose is actually to create so-called Sino-centric economic architecture. It's not like a system or architecture. I would say the Chinese people, or at least right now, we are not so good at constructing architecture or systems. We are good at construct infrastructure, these visible things, not the invisible rules or something like that. So, and also security. As I said, BRI right now at least is already beyond Asia. So I don't see the connection, actually, clear connection with so-called Asia security dynamics. It's mainly a development aid mechanism. This is my understanding.
Helpful. Professor Toto, is infrastructure, if this infrastructure is built, widely built across the region, historically that has had a pretty significant impact on trading patterns, on actually bad things as well, like, the bubonic plague famously, was carried by rats across the Silk Road. So it carries, good and bad things. But what would you, if there is a kind of significant new infrastructure map in the Asia-Pacific region, what do you think that's going to do to trade and knowledge, which you focused on in the region?
I'm not sure if I understand the question correctly, but I would like to mention that, so Professor Tu mentioned that BRI is a kind of a development aid. And one of my studies found that Japanese aid actually on infrastructure actually promoted foreign direct investment from Japan, not from other countries. So obviously, infrastructure aid can be a channel of foreign direct investment and trade. And also, it could influence political system in the recipient countries. I'm doing a lot of research in Ethiopia, and I saw a lot of infrastructure has been built in Ethiopia by Chinese aid. So then I can see that politically also Ethiopians are pretty much looking at China and are trying to follow the Chinese system. Despite of Professor Tu's statement, I think infrastructure aid can pave the road towards like a political architecture, and also trade, of course.
Interesting. Well, another topic that we are very interested in here in Shameless Advertising Department, if you haven't been to the microsite that we run, reconnectingasia.csis.org, please go there and you'll see a map of this region and 14,000, I think, and counting infrastructure projects in a database behind that. So we're doing a lot of work in this area, to be continued. So next, actually last year's results, do we have that? If we just flip them around. Okay, so definitely there was more sort of sense last year, even that this was going to lead to Sino-centric patterns of economic activity and be potentially impactful on the security dynamics. Interesting. Okay, let's move on to the next question. Back to trade. What is the most likely impact of Trump administration trade policy in Asia? So make sure your thing is still on, because sometimes it goes off if you haven't been using it for a while. Make sure the orange button's pressed. So more balanced trade, more protectionism. Again, vote early, vote often. Okay, well, there's a pretty clear trend, unless we have a sudden surge for E there. No. Come on, guys, be bold. All right. So start with you, Deborah. Do you think that's right? Is the U.S. out of luck here?
Well, I think that is true, but I actually think that the more alarming part is actually B, which is that the more the United States shows that it's okay to flout the rules, the more Asia thinks it's okay to flout the rules. So we, sitting in Asia, are spending most of our time, when we're not dealing with this trade war thing, dealing with nonstop problems and challenges in Asia that we would not have had to deal with before, which is countries that are putting up tariff barriers to one another, countries that are putting up poor digital policies to one another, countries that are engaged in a lot of behavior that they probably would not have done in the past if they thought that the rules still mattered and if the sheriff was still in town. But with the sheriff gone and the rules in doubt, we are spending an enormous amount of time dealing with countries in Asia, in particular, that have decided that protectionism is okay or that changing the rules domestically is okay, because what difference does it make?
Can you give one example?
Well,
how about Vietnam and digital rules?
Actually, Vietnam is, I mean, they have some, problem. I mean, there will be companies who say, wait a second, Vietnam cybersecurity is a big problem. But actually, I would argue that in the digital space, Indonesia is a particular challenge. So we are literally on Tuesday doing another workshop in Indonesia on, they're doing many things in Indonesia, but one thing that they're about to do is break the WTO customs moratorium on digital products. And so we're doing another workshop to help small businesses who are Indonesian understand why this matters to them, because then they can go argue to their own government why this is deeply problematic to them, because they're going to have to pay duties, they're going to have to do paperwork, they're going to have to pay taxes on imports of digital products like software, music, books, et cetera. And this is deeply alarming if you're a small business who has to rely on external products. and is much more alarming when the other parties do the same thing to you. So now you want to export your music, your software, your whatever, your apps, and everyone else has put up the same barriers to you. So we are spending an enormous amount of time on these kinds of things. So customs moratorium, backwards digital policies, data localization issues, e-commerce challenges. The digital thing is most of our time is actually in digital and in, of course, supply chain changes. But the digital part is deeply problematic because they are nonstop. And then new tariff policies that keep coming into effect, new standards that come out of nowhere that are WTO illegal. But again, who cares, right? Because U.S. doesn't care. We're going to lose the appellate body. So, it's a free-for-all. And I would say in the long run, protectionism in the region is, I think, the bigger threat.
Okay, lots more to talk about that, but do we have last year's? This is the last question that was the same as last year, I think, and then we have 3 new ones. But let's see, last year, so similar results, but the protectionism one was a little higher then. Interesting. Okay, next question, please. We just got 3 more. We're going to try and whip through those and then bring you into the question and answer. By the end of this summer, U.S. and China negotiations will have Oh, there's one brave soul who's voting for a comprehensive agreement. You want to show yourself? No? That's all right. No, that's okay. 2 people. There we go. Is that you, Professor Tu? And me. Okay. Anybody else? Keep voting. Keep voting if you haven't. All right, but we've got a pretty clear trend again here. So we're predicting an impasse. Okay, we're at an impasse, so that's maybe too easy a question. That's the status quo, I guess. Nobody thinks there's a possibility that Trump and Xi could decide to get this over with and shake hands and do a deal. Nobody's going to raise their hand to support that idea. But how about at least a Buenos Aires type of solution where they agreed to a 3-month negotiation to get this done in 3 months? That seems more possible, right, Professor Tu? That they could agree to that?
Yeah, probably. But it would be more difficult than before, I think. Because now the Chinese government has stated its 3 red lines. I mean, before this, actually, the Chinese government has had more space to make a deal, make more concessions. But right now, the red lines have been set, so it would be more difficult for China to make more concessions. But then it depends on whether the U.S. government would like to accept these red lines. But I think it's
Can you just tell the audience quickly what the 3 red lines are? Just to...
The first one is to cancel all additional tariffs. Second is the import commitments should be reasonable. Then the third one is the agreement should be equal, fair, something like that. There are some flexibilities in these 3 red lines, but still there is less space for the Chinese government. But one thing is, it seems that the U.S. administration really loves tariffs. So then it would be very difficult for, at least the first red line, it's very difficult for the U.S. government to accept it. But that red line is, I think, the clearest red line for China. So then I also choose C. But yeah, that one, the 2, okay. I'm not one of them.
All right. I'm sure there'll be questions and discussion about that, including in the next panel. So let's move on to the last 2 questions. So there's a Japan question, basically same question. End of the summer, U.S.-Japan, deal, no deal? keep voting. Again, the trend lines are pretty clear here unless we have a surge of the right answer, which is D. But C, interestingly, Professor Toto, there seems to be thought that there will be a deal as soon as this fall. Do you think so?
Yeah, I'm not very sure. I wish I could choose A. But again, I actually saw many Japanese were opposed to TPP, just a few years ago, and many Japanese, frankly, are very much afraid of U.S. How to say, multinationals or whatever. So I'm sure that if the negotiation is going on, then more and more Japanese are worried about the U.S. and also they will be against the trade agreement.
The reason I'm not sure about how a trade agreement in goods alone gets done is that implies that what that means is that Japan is going to give the U.S. the same agricultural access that it gives other TPP members. That's what the U.S. really needs, and then the U.S. is going to reciprocate in some way by giving Japan, the kind of treatment it gave to autos and auto parts in TPP. But the latter requires Congress to approve that change, and I just think once you do a congressional review of this, it's going to take a heck of a lot longer than people think. But that's my view. So again, lots more to talk about there. Maybe there'll be questions. Last question, and this is for you, Deborah, I think, which is who's next for a bilat? Who should be next for a bilat?
Should be next.
Okay, that's just the first person voting. Don't worry, we can still. Who should be next? Yeah, there's an E this time. But only if you really think there's another country. You have another country in mind. It's not a cop-out to say, no idea. The word should maybe opens up some, discussion, but Deborah, do you want to take a quick stab at that, and then we'll let people weigh in?
Yes, but this is going to make me very unpopular. My answer would be, why would anyone sign an agreement with this administration,
Why?
especially...
We don't have a why on here.
especially after Mexico. Like, why would you do that? What is it worth the piece of paper that you've just signed, when you can have it upturned or thrown out in an instant, in a tweet, in the middle of the night, and everything you just worked for is no good? I don't understand why anyone would line up to. I've always thought this was, puzzling to begin with, but particularly, if you weren't paying attention and you somehow missed that, Mexico over this migration business should have said, like, holy cow, why on earth would I do such a thing? And so if I were any one of these countries, I would say, wow, okay, I'm going to go through very painful domestic political reforms that are going to be demanded of me by the United States, which I will agree to do for I don't know what reason, but whatever, I will do it. And then at the last minute, for what? So, who should do it? From the U.S. perspective, everybody. The U.S. should be doing, agreements with everybody because they're losing credibility. But, then who would be the counterparty to that? I don't know.
Okay, we're obviously going to need bigger clickers next year so we can get a Y on here. All right, thank you all. That was great. We're not quite done because I'd like to invite the audience to come in. There are microphones that will be brought to you if you raise your hand, and then please do be concise. And we might take a cluster because we don't have a huge amount of time. So there's a gentleman there. Do I see any other hands? Think about it. If you have a question, I'll take them in a cluster if we have others.
Thank you. Well, thank you for the presentation. I'm coming from Ecuador, so we don't have a trade agreement with any of the countries that once mentioned here. But I want just to take advantage of your experience. So in terms of inclusive development for these countries, for example, Vietnam, that you have mentioned a lot of times, so what of the models is better? I know that it's not a univocal answer that you can give to us, but just to have an idea, for example, the RCIP or the CTPP, which is better in order for having the internal normative changes in order to develop countries. Thank you.
Benefits for the countries that are signing on for their internal development. Okay. Does Ecuador want a bilateral FTA with the United States?
No, but I think we are the only country that are struggling to have these negotiations. So thank you for your advice in this case.
All right. Okay. That's anybody else that we can cluster it? If not, does somebody want to take that on? Which of these approaches is best for the country's internal development?
So that's a great question. You know, the reason why we do trade is not because we're so interested in trade itself necessarily, or trade agreements because we like trade agreements, but really because they lead, we think, it's that there's no silver bullet for development, but trade and trade agreements get you closer than anything else. So that's why we're enthusiastic about trade, and we like trade agreements because they help anchor in commitments that are important. So you can do lots of things unilaterally. You don't actually need a trade agreement to do the right thing. You can just do the right thing. But for reasons that I find a bit puzzling, many countries have forgotten that unilateral action is allowable, and you can just do the right thing because it makes sense. So many countries are holding out now for a trade agreement as the mechanism for them to do sensible, smart things. Okay, so in that environment, what kind of trade agreements make the most sense? It's the more painful ones tend to be the higher quality, higher ambition agreements, but they also tend to pay off more. And so that is why we particularly need Vietnam to be successful out of CPTPP. Because if you can show that CPTPP, high quality, high ambition, deep commitments, 600 pages of rules roughly, thousands of pages of schedules, actually delivers results in Vietnam, that is super important, because then everyone says, well, then that's worthwhile. I should sign on to that kind of agreement. If Vietnam doesn't do well out of CPTPP, which I don't think is going to happen, thankfully, but if it doesn't do well, then people will say, why would I sign on to these super complicated agreements? I should sign on to the sort of much more flexible, lots of, policy space kinds of agreements that give me the ability to do whatever I feel like doing whenever I feel like doing them. And the downside of that, of having extra flexibilities, extra policy space, especially for developing countries, is the point of an agreement is to signal, especially to companies, that this is the environment in which you will be operating. You're reducing risk and uncertainty. You want to create, I would argue, an environment that is more stable for companies so that they say, okay, I know what the rules are. They're unlikely to shift in the short run, and so therefore it makes sense for me to invest, to plan for the long run, to do the kind of expensive development that matters, rather than short projects or whatever that could go, could leave, whatever. So those require, I think, higher quality, higher ambition commitments. And if you need to anchor them in a trade agreement to get the domestic political will to agree, sometimes it's better to blame it on someone else. I didn't really want to do this to you guys, but unfortunately my other partner, they made me do it, so what can I do? I have to impose these painful reforms domestically to satisfy these guys. But the end result is you get a much better economic environment for your firms and for foreign firms who want to come in and invest and build jobs and so forth. So that's what I would suggest. Higher quality, higher ambition. Doesn't have to be in a trade agreement. You can do it on your own because it just makes sense to do it. But if that's politically difficult, then signing an agreement with someone, and at least then the good news is, assuming you can get the agreement done, you can then blame them for whatever the challenges are. We would have loved to have protected you forever, but sadly those people over there are making us do this, and the net result should be, hopefully, enough economic growth with some redistribution policies domestically to solve the problems.
There is or was, Professor Tu, in China a debate like this about the usefulness of these agreements, including specifically TPP. There was certainly in 2013 about the benefits of joining TPP to help drive the domestic reforms that China needed to do anyway. Is that still alive, that sense, or is there now, a sense that that's not that useful to China?
As I said, we still think it's necessary to have some foreign pressures to push forward China's domestic reform. Because actually since the year of 2008, domestic reforms have been, to some extent, slowed down in some aspects, some difficult aspects, including SOE reform. Even earlier, I think, when the United States decided to join the TPP, in China, there already was a discussion about joining TPP, or at least promoting our domestic reform faster. So yeah, I do think that that is necessary, especially for politically sensitive and difficult issues.
Okay. Are there other questions, or people just really want to get to break? Okay, you had a question before. Can I ask Ito-san there? And then the lady behind, and then we'll stop.
Thank you very much for an impressive presentation and comments from all of you. And I have a question for Deborah-san. You mentioned that the supply chain has not been really affected in the short term, and I agree with that. But Department of Commerce has expanded the entity list, and there was a presidential decree on 5G, and there's also ACRA, Pharma, and now Chinese government is also trying to make their entity list. So my question is, how do you think those regulatory change and the compliance risk will affect ASEAN governments and industries? And from U.S. perspective, in order not to push away ASEAN companies to Chinese side, what's your suggestion?
And let's take the woman behind Ayumi. There we go.
Hi, my name is Piper Campbell. I worked on U.S. ASEAN policy through the end of last year. So I have two ASEAN-related questions, one for Ms. Elms and one for Mr. Tu. I'll do Mr. Tu first. It's simpler. My question for you is it more in the Chinese government's interest to work with ASEAN as the ASEAN architecture, or to actually splinter ASEAN and work bilaterally with the countries of ASEAN? And then I'm kind of showing my hand a bit. So Professor Elms, my question was a little bit led by one of the slides, which pointed to the possibility of there being greater ASEAN Asian economic integration with the U.S. left out. And I wondered whether you're seeing within ASEAN, as a result of the U.S.-China trade tensions, sort of more focus on ASEAN integration, or in fact, if some of the tensions and some of the differences among the ASEAN countries are growing in this space. So for example, the very different approach that a Vietnam, or different benefits that would accrue to a Vietnam versus a Cambodia, whether those sorts of things are coming to the fore more. Thank you.
I think we will do both, right? Depending on specific issues. It's also the case in China-Europe relations. We have a very close relationship with the EU, but also we're developing bilateral relationships with individual EU states. Then, as I said, it just depends on specific issues.
Some great questions. So I said that tariffs themselves, no one wants tariffs. So we have hundreds of companies right now at USTR complaining about the next list of tariffs for good reason. So no one likes them, and they would prefer not to have them, but those are manageable. The entities list is a different thing entirely, because that is not the normal thing you're used to dealing with. And the sort of complete rupture of being able to do business is something else entirely. That is not normal, and companies, I think, are not sure even how to handle this. This is a totally different environment. Well, how do we adjust? Can we adjust? How do we need to do it? You know, that's a very different animal. And some of the regulatory changes can be more complicated, actually, than the tariffs. I mean, at least with a tariff, you know what it is. It might change at this point in an instant, but at least you know what that is and you know how to deal with that. The regulatory changes can be more complicated because you don't always know that they're coming, you don't know how they'll apply. The compliance costs for regulatory changes can be higher than a tariff change. So the regulatory changes are the kinds of things that really could keep companies up at night, and entities list especially among them. Is this changing in ASEAN? Definitely. I mean, one of the things that should be noted is that for ASEAN, in fact, all of Asia, China is now the #1 or #2 import and export market for every country in Asia. So if you're going, and then I would say this is a final nice point, if you're going to make Asia choose sides in a trade war, this is getting awfully complicated. And the more that you ask countries to make decisions and choose sides, the harder it is for them to choose. And you may not be so happy with the way in which they end up choosing. Because the end result is, these are countries that are in the neighborhood, and do you want to be happier with the country that's in the neighborhood or the country that may not be in the neighborhood? This is not something that governments are excited about, I would say. No matter where they fall on the spectrum, this is really unpleasant. And trying to get a win-win outcome, which Asia always loves, is almost impossible at a time like this. So if you can't get a win-win outcome, this is, how do you navigate this really shifting environment is not easy. And so for ASEAN in particular, are they finding more fragmentation? At the moment, I think no. The longer this drags on, the more fragmentation they may have. But at the moment, at least, it looks like at the ASEAN level, not as much fragmentation as you might think. A little bit more integration, because the chaos is causing them to say, wow, maybe we should focus on getting a few deliverables that make sense. RCEP in particular, that's the key deliverable, I think, for ASEAN/RCEP this year. And then after that, as this drags on and gets more complicated, you may see different splits. You already see some new challenges in ASEAN itself. The TPP countries, non-TPP countries, the ones who are benefiting from the ones who aren't, the ones who are more tightly connected to BRI and China, the ones who aren't. I mean, there's a lot of new challenges that ASEAN has not addressed, has not faced, and how they resolve this is really an interesting question. So for people who have watched ASEAN for a long time, I mean, it's not always been the most fascinating place to study, but actually suddenly it's become much more interesting than it used to be, because it's now being buffeted in ways that it wasn't before. And the rhetoric that we're going to survive this buffeting is now like up against the, really, are you going to survive it, and how? In-your-face sort of challenge that it didn't have to deal with before. So it's kind of interesting, and I suggest that some of you who weren't paying attention to ASEAN might actually start to pay attention to it, because it's gotten far more interesting.
Okay, well, I heard challenges and chaos and unpleasant and various bad things, but I also heard opportunities and integration and interesting and good words like that. So let's end on those happy words. Before you thank the panel, let me just say two things. First of all, there's a break now, and up on the Sam Nunn Terrace, there's coffee and I think edibles as well, snacks. And so please enjoy that and be back here at 11:31. And second thing is, do not take these with you. I'm telling you, you take them with you, Eri Hirano is going to come running after you, and she will find you. So do not take that with you. But now join me, please, in thanking this terrific panel. Thank you.
Thank you.
So thank you. We'll resume now with a dialogue up here with three of the leading thinkers on private sector interests in all the issues we've been talking about. Trade, integration, trade agreements, decoupling, tariffs. The clickers are no longer mobilized, but we'll invite your questions after a brief discussion up here at the table. So I'm joined, I'm going to start down there, by Charles Freeman. Charles is Senior Vice President for Asia at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. He's former Assistant USTR for China Affairs. We overlapped when I was at the NSC at that time. He was the PepsiCo Vice President for Global Public Policy. He's an alum of CSIS, where he was a Freeman Chair in China Studies. And he has a Doctor of Law degree from Boston University School of Law and a bachelor's degree in Asian Studies and Economics from Tufts University. Lorraine Hawley is Senior Director for International Government Relations at the Archer Daniels Midland Company. She served earlier in her career as the Director of International Government Relations at ADM and as International Government Affairs Manager for Chevron, focused in particular on Asia and the Pacific. And she had one of these unique opportunities to transfer from the private sector into the East Asia Bureau of the State Department in 2009, 2010, right during the so-called pivot to Asia, actually right before the pivot to Asia. I guess you set it up, where she worked on economic and energy portfolios, I guess under Kurt Campbell at the time. She's, like me, a CSIS alum. And Aaron Cooper, to my immediate right, is the Vice President for Global Policy at the Business Software Alliance, where he leads the Alliance's global policy team on issues particularly focused on data privacy, cybersecurity, intellectual property, and trade. He served earlier as Chief Counsel to Chairman Patrick Leahy of the U.S. Senate's Judiciary Committee. He worked at Covington and Burley, and he was legal counselor for my old Senators Paul Sarbanes, and has clerked for federal judges. So I want to start, a lot of the discussion that Matt led us through, the clickers, talked about the consequences of tariffs, of trade agreements, of decoupling, of integration, of diversion of digital and other norm setting. And so this is a real opportunity to hear about how those issues affect the private sector, but also how the private sector is organizing to try to support a more engaged U.S. trade and economic policy in the Asia Pacific. So I want to talk about both those aspects. We'll get to the politics in a moment. But let me open by asking each of the panelists their broad assessment of how the U.S. is doing on trade policy in Asia right now. The good, the bad, and the ugly, as it affects each of these different, connected but very different sectors of the U.S. economy and global economic development. I want to start with Charles, because these days at the Chamber of Commerce, it's very important to give people an opportunity to be tweeted at by the White House. So Charles, why don't you open up, tell us a bit about your overall view and your constituents' and members' view of the trade policy that's unfolding.
Thanks, Mike, and it's great. Thanks for the opportunity to be back at CSIS, although when I was at CSIS, we were in a much shabbier location, with due respect to the landlords at 1800K. You know, I think stepping back a second to have the president and the administration articulate that they're aiming for a free, fair, and reciprocal trade policy with the rest of the world and with Asia. Well, obviously, we're in favor of that. I'm not sure that when we say reciprocal, we're focused on bilateral trade surpluses or deficits. But in terms of opportunity, we're clearly in favor of reciprocity of opportunity. And so from that standpoint, we're clearly in favor. And if you go back, even with respect to the 301 that kicked off, the 301 investigation which kicked off the China trade war, you go through it, and a lot of the data that led to that was supported the findings of the report were footnoted to reports that were issued by the chamber. So there are plenty of things in that the administration is aiming for that we support. I mean, again, and it comes down to in many cases right diagnosis of the challenge, but the wrong prescription. And you know, we are not tariff guys at the Chamber. We don't think it's helpful. And as was raised earlier by Deborah and others, the business likes transparency. We like predictability. We don't like wild swings in the business environment and policies that throw into question whether your investments will be successful tomorrow or the next day or the next day. And the tariff approach really has been very damaging across the board to our membership and how they view the rest of the rest of the administration's policies.
Where does Charles? Where does
Yeah, no, I mean,
sorry, thank you. I couldn't understand why you were applauding. It wasn't that good a question. To repeat, Charles, tell us where trade sort of ranks in the priorities for the Chamber and for your members, because my impression was a few years ago it was important, but it was not as important as things like tax cuts and regulatory issues. But it's more important now, it seems. Where does it rank for your members?
Well, I mean, you know, how do you choose which is your favorite children? You know, the Chamber really has been very supportive of the domestic agenda, particularly on the reduction of the tax burden, the reduction of the regulatory burden, and all those things. Those have been very positive, and the numbers bear that out in terms of business confidence in the economy and our membership's willingness to invest back in the domestic economy. That's taken off. But you're starting to see the trade issues becoming a real headwind on business confidence and willingness to invest in the U.S. and the broader economy. So it's right up there. And, you know, if we have to look out and say, okay, everything's going great, but here's the biggest challenge, that's clearly, you know, you can look at immigration and sort of the challenges there for employment and the rest of the things. But trade is certainly right at the top of the list. It's my favorite child.
Oh, yeah. So, Lorraine, I know from my own experience in the White House that agricultural interests are incredibly important to any effort by any administration to get any trade deal moving. And so, you know, your company, other associations have been critical, but it seems fairly recent that agriculture interests have started coming together in what you call the dialogue. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about the dialogue and also the broad view, that's a lot of different interests within that group, the broad view of how the administration's doing.
Absolutely, Mike. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today. So for those of you that don't know, ADM is a global agribusiness company. We operate in 160 countries around the world and employ about 33,000 people. We came together with those in our community within the agriculture food sector to form the Agriculture and Food Dialogue for Trade. This was formed actually when we were in the nascent stages of the TTIP negotiations, but we got it back together again during the beginning of the Trump administration to address some of the objectives that we had for the trade negotiations under this administration. And so I guess when we look at the trade agenda and where we currently stand now, I think there are a few key points that I would want to make. And the first one I'll talk about is actually not related to Asia, but probably something you all are watching right now, which is the progress of USMCA passage. The agriculture and food sector is very pleased with the outcome that we found in the USMCA. It retained the core provisions that have served the food and agriculture sector so well over the last 24 years, but then also was an opportunity to include modernization, so for the SPS, the sanitary phytosanitary chapter, for rules of origin, biotech, market access for wheat. So we're very pleased with what the outcomes were in that agreement, and we think that there are lessons learned from that negotiation that can be replicated within the context of, for example, a U.S.-Japan free trade agreement. Talking about Japan, I think that agreement we have a lot of optimism around. We're very pleased that we've learned that the two governments will meet in July after the Diet elections to discuss agriculture market access. For us, Japan would be an extremely important market. It was one of the largest markets within the CPTPP, and it is the 4th largest export market currently for American agriculture products. So seeing a U.S.-Japan free trade agreement come to fruition and passed in the U.S. Congress would be very, very important in terms of an outcome that would be meaningful to the American agricultural community. And then a topic that, of course, will come up, has come up and will continue to come up today is related to the trade negotiations with China. Clearly, the American agriculture sector has been hit by retaliatory tariffs as a result of the ongoing trade discussions between the two countries. I think that we understand very much the administration's interest in seeing these long-standing issues related to the systemic areas, intellectual property, cyber theft, tech transfer, addressed with China. And that's something as an American company that's doing business in China that we support. These are issues, that have needed to be addressed for some time. Clearly, the tariffs for us, the retaliatory tariffs, are a challenge. And we would acknowledge, though, that the tariffs on the U.S. side have been successful in getting China to the negotiating table. We continue to feel optimistic about the outlook for a deal between the two governments. I think both countries know we need each other. We're 2 of the largest economies, and we come to agriculture. We are 2 of the largest producers and consumers of food and agriculture products. So we continue to feel optimistic that there will be a deal. We're very pleased the 2 leaders are meeting during the G20 next week, and so we remain optimistic about a positive outcome at some point. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. So Aaron, tell us first a little bit, for those who don't know it, about the Software Alliance, and then how your members look at some of these issues.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. I represent BSA, the Software Alliance, which is primarily an association of enterprise software companies. So companies that are providing cloud computing, data analytics, development of AI to a range of companies from the agriculture sector to manufacturing and pretty much everybody that Charles represents at the Chamber. And I can strike an optimistic note here because our focus, because we're the software industry, is on digital trade and the importance of making sure that, for instance, data can flow across borders easily so that when you're doing analytics of crop yields, or you're doing customer relations management, or you're running an HR processing system, the ability to transfer data from one place to another for your IoT devices and for other things is crucial to the way companies across all sectors are conducting business and getting a competitive advantage by using the most advanced data analytics. We've been really pleased that with respect to some of the initial negotiations around USMCA, for instance, that digital trade has been a priority. It's an easy one to be a priority in that it is something that wasn't part of earlier agreements. The TPP, which we were very supportive of, it was the first agreement that has digital trade provisions, it has enforceable provisions on data flows and prohibiting data localization requirements. And the USMCA took that one step further, and between Canada, Mexico, and the United States has, once it goes through Congress, enforceable provisions that are even a step stronger than where TPP was. And it makes us very optimistic about further negotiations with Japan in particular, where you have like-minded countries that see the importance of making sure that the data economy can be successful, not just because of tech sectors within the US or Japan, but because any other industry, any other local industry to be successful needs the most advanced analytic tools in order to compete in a global environment. So we see a lot of real possibility. It's an issue where both Congress and the administration see it as a priority and see it in the same way, and there aren't very many of those. And so we're pleased that at least on the digital trade issues, there's been a lot of progress, and we've seen some good developments through the USMCA and making it one of the priorities for the early harvest between U.S. and Japan.
Let me ask about some of the specific trade agreements, if I could, next. And let's focus on the U.S.-Japan. Ambassador Lighthizer, Minister Motegi sounded a very optimistic note. They're going to meet in July. I think Matt and I and others who don't have skin in the game and are just sort of watching and know Japanese politics are having a hard time understanding how a trade agreement can get through the Japanese diet that's not reciprocal. So the obvious ask on the U.S. side is TPP levels of ag access. Lorraine, correct me if I'm wrong. The pretty strongly held view in Tokyo is, well, there's got to be reciprocal to be WTO consistent, to be politically viable in the diet, and the TPP issue was, light trucks, auto parts. It's hard for me to see the president giving on that, given the politics this year. And then, as you mentioned, Aaron, I think ag is very interested in the old, but very important TPP levels of access. But some of those issues have moved on since TPP to USMCA. So I'd be interested in each of your takes on what a good U.S.-Japan outcome would look like from your perspectives. I think maybe you have the most at stake, Lorraine. So we'll start with you.
Thank you. No, we have plenty to say about this. Thank you. I think, yes, we want to see as a baseline the provisions for market access that were included in the CPTPP for a U.S.-Japan bilateral free trade agreement for agriculture. I think we also want to make sure that we're looking at the EU-Japan Economic Partnership Agreement provisions as well, because they also include market access for agriculture, and we want to make sure that as the U.S. is being considered, that we would be coming in on a level playing field. When you look at improvements in what could be done to kind of modernize the U.S.-Japan Free Trade Agreement past the CPTPP, like I said earlier, you could look to the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement and adopt some of those provisions, including SPS, sanitary, phytosanitary, the biotech provisions, and that would help to bring the U.S.-Japan Free Trade Agreement negotiations past the CPTPP and make them a little bit more modern. So I think those are some of the things that we would see as far as our objectives and the ideal outcome. I would note that because the CPTPP has been implemented and the EU-Japan EPA has also been implemented, that we are very hopeful that these negotiations move quickly, because we are vulnerable to lost market access to these competitors who have duty-free or reduced tariff market access now to Japan. And so while I mentioned Japan was the 4th largest export market for American agriculture, that may eventually erode as the implementation continues and as the CPTPP member countries as well as the EU have enhanced market access that we just don't enjoy. So we're very hopeful these negotiations move quickly.
Lorraine, can I ask to follow up? The market loss makes a lot of sense when you think about the trade classes I took at CSIS. Is it theoretical, or are things already happening? Are your members already feeling the squeeze because of our participation in TPP?
There are members of our sector who are definitely feeling or seeing the initial stages of this competitive advantage that the CPTPP members have in particular. I don't think we're in a state where there's a significant impact yet, but that will obviously happen over a period of time.
And Aaron, what's a good outcome from your perspective for the U.S.-Japan talks?
I think it's very important that digital trade be part of it. It's something that we've been pushing very hard for, and because the U.S. and Japan had previously agreed on many of the digital trade provisions as part of the TPP agreement, and the U.S. then took that one step further in USMCA, I think it makes it very viable that it be one of the easy things that you can enhance from previous trade agreements, both on the Japanese side and on the American side. And even though both countries have really good domestic laws on these issues, it's important that like-minded nations start putting together what a solid international framework is going to look like.
And you don't see that as a heavy political lift?
No, it's actually, it's one of the things that the administration has been very strong in support of. Congress has also been strongly supportive of. You see it not just in questions asked at hearings, but also just in the TPA document itself. Digital trade is one of the things that is specifically called out, and I think that's been a really positive combination of effort from Congress and from the administration.
Charles?
I don't think that anything less than a truly comprehensive, reciprocal, as you say, trade agreement between Japan and the United States would pass political muster here. I just don't see it. And everything that USTR is saying in terms of its negotiating objectives that it's submitted to Congress and the conversations that we've been having suggest that that comprehensive agreement is what they're looking for. Yes, there's certainly a possibility of doing things in stages where where some politically helpful concessions on ag and on autos kind of gets the ball rolling. But ultimately, I think we're headed to a comprehensive agreement, and in private talks in both capitals, it seems that's where we're heading. So I'm at least hopeful of that. I worry a little bit about expectations on the ag side, because the longer we go on, the more market access is being taken up by Japan's new partners and existing partners, to the detriment of our exporters. And candidly, because of the way the TPP and the Icp Tpp ag concessions were negotiating with Japan, additional exports to Japan can trigger surges in tariffs and would cut the benefits to our ag sector. So it's not simply as simple as we want the TPP benefits that we no longer have.
On balance, Charles, don't your members prefer multilateral agreements like TPP to bilateral agreements? Or is it a more nuanced and differentiated perspective?
Our members prefer liberalization wherever it's found. Politically, it's not that much easier to pass a bilateral, as you remember, to pass a bilateral agreement with Australia or Morocco rather than a TPP or a broader multilateral agreement. So, we'd rather do multilateral. I understand that there's a perception of greater leverage from the U.S. side in a bilateral agreement, but I'm not sure that the way we're seeing bilateral negotiations proceed, that leverage is yielding particularly concrete results.
I think part of our challenge with Japan is going to be a good chunk of the leverage for us was the multilateral aspect and what that brought for Japan. So we have a little bit less to offer, maybe a lot less to offer when we're doing it bilaterally. It makes the politics of what we're describing harder. But as we've been saying, Motegi and Lighthizer are sounding notes of optimism, and as we all know, that's not normally what happens in U.S.-Japan trade talks, so fingers crossed. Let's go to China. It looks like President Trump will meet Xi Jinping for a bilateral on the margins of the G20 summit in Osaka. Same question, what's a good outcome? What would you like to see? What would be a bad outcome? Why don't you start us off, Charles?
Good outcome of that conversation?
Yeah, I mean, just going back to the earlier session, the slide had 4 options. Yeah. Nobody voted, well, 2 mysterious people voted for a real agreement. Yeah. One of them was not Professor Tu, he admitted. The overwhelming view in the room was it's going to be some kind of stalemate.
Yeah, no, I mean, look, I mean...
and I'm not asking for a prediction so much as what would be an outcome.
What would be a good outcome? First of all, I think the Chinese side has said they should meet President Hui, meet President Trump. So that hasn't fully been confirmed yet, but we'll see. I'm assuming it's going to happen, and I'm assuming the 2 leaders who really do want to see a cessation of the tensions and a return to the talks on some form. I think we'll see some market calming statement and a return to negotiations. So you'll see something, I would assume, similar to Buenos Aires than anything else. The notion that we'll get a comprehensive agreement any time before the end of this year is doubtful to me. And then the question for my mind becomes, did the Chinese start looking at the political calendar here and saying, okay, maybe it'd be easier to deal with a Pete Buttigieg or whomever than a Donald Trump. So, which I think would be dangerous, but that's a separate conversation.
Lorraine, are there offensive objectives for you in this U.S.-China negotiation, or is it mainly about getting these tariffs to end?
Well, I'll just reiterate the fact that we're very pleased that the 2 leaders are scheduled to meet during the G20. I think a good outcome for us from the agricultural standpoint would be to see resumed market access to China. It was our top export market. In 2017, we shipped $16 billion of soybeans alone to China, and so it will continue to be a very important export market. I think, if you're asking for a bad outcome, I think a bad outcome would be that the negotiations just stall and there's, no progress being made moving forward. The optimist in me does not think that will be the case. The American farmer and agricultural community tend to be optimists, and so we are hopeful and believe that there will be a positive outcome at some point. It may not be this year, it may be later than that, but we do believe that both governments really want to see a resolution here, and our trade relationship is just too important to let things go for very long.
Well, then I'll be optimistic too then. I think any ratcheting down of the tensions is really important. We do, as an industry, have serious concerns with some policies within China that make market access difficult. We think tariffs are not helping the situation, and to the extent that both sides can get together, and even if it's not a comprehensive deal, at least start moving in the direction of trying to limit some of the market access barriers and also try to relieve some of the pressure that's coming from the tariffs, I think would be a positive outcome.
And for your industry, Aaron, the broader G20 agenda is, I would think, at least as important as the bilateral discussion. And, Prime Minister Abe has made an effort to lead with a free flow of data with trust and other initiatives. I think the Japanese government has, made heroic efforts to try to bridge the enormous gap between the U.S. and Europe on digital issues. I mean, who wouldn't want to get between the U.S. and Europe? I don't know, but I think it's largely Japanese leadership that's produced these trilateral statements. Tell us a bit about what your ambitions would be for that broader agenda that Abe-san is championing in the G20.
Yeah, so I think at the ministerial, the document that came out that addressed a lot of the digital trade issues that we care about was excellent and not easy given the countries involved in the G20. But I think the Japanese and the Prime Minister's concept of free flow of data with trust is a good one, and especially as it was elaborated on through the ministerial meeting, because I think it helps to start to bring together different countries, some of which have thought a lot about free flow of data issues and data localization issues, and some which really haven't yet. But it brought them all together around a concept of trying to make sure that data can flow freely, but provided that there's some accountability, that if you're transferring some personal data from one country to another, you continue to respect the privacy laws from the country that you're transferring from. And I think it's important to start to coalesce international consensus around those principles, and it's great for it to happen at the G20. It's also really important that it happen in bilateral, multilateral trade agreements where there's an enforceability component to it. I think that's one of the things that was excellent about the TPP. It's one of the things that we really hope to see in U.S.-Japan and was in USMCA.
Let's turn to the mega theme for this conference, which is the United States decoupling from Asia's economic architecture. As we were saying earlier this morning, we've done 13 of these before with JETRO, where each year we had some theme about economic integration. And with our colleagues from JETRO, we realized this is probably the year where we have to start asking this question: Is decoupling happening? Is it conceivable? So I want to break that down in some pieces. I think one piece is tariffs, which Matt's panel talked about. A second piece is the trade agreements and being in them or not in them. I think those are different problem sets. And then the third one is the national security, or national security on steroids, 5G, Huawei, decoupling questions. So I'm going to ask you about each of those. So starting with tariffs, the President likes tariffs. Most of your constituents don't. What is the impact of tariffs on your industry or on your members? In the earlier panel, people got to vote on that, and the question was, well, it encourages more protectionism, which Deborah pointed out is maybe the most worrisome part. The audience was more focused on, lost opportunities. If we're doing tariffs on our friends and allies, we're threatening Section 232. It's awfully hard to cooperate on new 21st century issues like digital reciprocity. So there's opportunity costs, there's immediate impact on industry, there's retaliation. So just because this, I suspect, part of the reason we're hearing more from the Chamber, more from your alliance, is concern about growing protectionism, really. So going down the line, start with you, Charles. What do tariffs do? What are the scenarios we worry about? What are they doing now? We heard from the earlier panel that I think Deborah pointed out that the actual supply chains, at least measured by shipping, are not changing. What do you see? What do you worry about?
Yeah, I mean, it's a fundamental question, and to the extent that part of the tariff strategy has been to onshore part of the supply chain from Asia back to the United States, we're not seeing a lot of that. Really, as Deborah I think pointed out, things are sticky. It's really hard to move production, particularly in higher value goods, from one place to another in a certain period of time. So, if you look at our members and you ask them, okay, what are you thinking about in terms of your supply chain, in terms of removing it from China or from Asia or whatever, there's about a third of them that say, already did it. We've moved production to Vietnam or Thailand in some cases, or in some cases Mexico. About a third of them say, we've done the math and we just, we're sunk. We're going to have to eat, if it's 25% tariffs, that's what we'll have to eat for the foreseeable future, unless an entity list intervenes and we're not able to sell. And then the third are saying, well, it's a matter of time. If this goes on for 9 months, a year, 6 more months, or 2 more years, then we'll face significant challenges. But let's remember that, particularly in the case of China, that there were already competitive challenges that were causing companies to rethink exposure to the marketplace as much as it had been. And so there were already decisions that were being taken with respect to where's the next market, or where's the next place for a supplier for the supply chain. And so the tariff thing has accelerated that a bit. But still, you have the basic issue of costs and timing.
Are you seeing evidence of bad behavior because governments in the region are saying, well, heck, if the Americans are going to use questionable national security justifications for tariffs, or, use tariffs to try to solve immigration issues, or, why shouldn't we have more tariffs, non-tariff barriers? Are you seeing that bad behavior that Deborah mentioned?
Yeah, there's certainly been on the retaliatory side, some bad behavior in terms of slowing down on licensing decisions and that kind of thing in certain markets. And then you wonder whether issues on cyber in Indonesia and Vietnam and elsewhere, and even places like Malaysia, are whether the decisions that are being taken there, are impacted by the notion that, well, okay, the gloves are off. And we can make decisions that we wouldn't ordinarily have made because the sheriff's no longer in town.
Well, we always would prefer tariff-free trade. And I think as we look to feed a growing global population, we benefit, all of our consumers in our countries benefit when there are duty-free food and agriculture products, because that allows our countries to provide safe, reliable, affordable food, feed, and fuel for their consumers. I think that, we as the agriculture sector are always at the tip of the spear when it comes to retaliatory tariffs. We're a very attractive target because of our volume and perceived political influence. And so we've seen that in all of these cases where there have been implementation of tariffs on products coming into the U.S., we have usually been at the front of the retaliatory tariffs on the other side. And so that obviously is a problem for our industry. We were pleased, for example, when the administration decided to review, the 232 tariffs on steel and aluminum as they pertain to Canada and Mexico, and we're hopeful that maybe that model can be replicated when it comes to other countries, maybe the EU, for example, so that we can resume, fullest market access. Once the 232 tariffs were dropped here for Canada and Mexico, the tariffs were dropped here. The retaliatory tariffs were, of course, dropped by Canada and Mexico, and so, many of our products in the food and agriculture sector were able to then resume market access duty-free, which was very important for our competitiveness.
So I don't think your companies are targets the way Lorraine's are, but Charles made an interesting point. Atmospherically, do tariffs complicate your, effort to get rules?
Yes, and it has effects for a few different reasons. So I kind of look at it in maybe 3 different buckets. One is when tariffs start to be used for foreign policy objectives that aren't related to traditional trade purposes, that can cause problems. They're just not really the right tool for it. The second is there are some tariffs that do hit our companies directly. If you're anytime you're using cloud computing, what that really means is you have a server somewhere, and the equipment that goes into the server have tariff lines associated with them, and that price is going to get passed on to the consumers. But the third is when tariffs hit other portions of industry. Well, our companies, the enterprise software community, is providing services to those companies. And when their bottom line goes down and they're looking at raising prices on customers, it also means that they're not going to be using the same kind of advanced analytic tools. And I think for all those reasons, we look at tariffs as not the best tool for, even though it doesn't, for the most part, have a direct impact.
So the one area of quote-unquote decoupling that seems to me to be real and have some support in the Congress is in the area of national security, and in particular 5G. But where you draw that line is pretty. National security is catnip for protectionists. So where you draw that line is tricky. I think there's probably a broad consensus in the Congress that banning Huawei made sense for national security reasons. But the entities list, which complicates every business and all our allies' economic policies and supply chains and everything. It may have been a bridge too far. It is not unthinkable we would have some decoupling. After all, we have that with satellites, nuclear power. There are a lot of areas where sensitive national security or national champions where we've had decoupling. But now we're talking about something that controls the Internet of Things. It's bigger than those. So I'd be interested in that aspect of decoupling. I think maybe hit you hardest in some ways. We can start with you, Aaron. Is that something you worry about? Is there a scalable kind of decoupling in the national security space? How do your members think about that?
Well, I think the national security considerations are something that in every trade agreement you have that as an exception, right? And I think that's important. You need to be transparent about how country is using it. But I think it's a legitimate. When used properly, it's a legitimate tool for countries to use. I think complete decoupling really becomes not practical. I mean, think about most of the software that we use is built upon open source in some way. So you're going to have contributors to the code from all around the world, even before it becomes, before companies provide the value add that they then sell. So I think while there can be some separation, particularly when there's a clearly identifiable national security need, we need to be clear that there's not going to be, we're not going to be able to go back to a place where all of our technology components or software development is going to happen in one place, that everything is built upon something that happens in the international community.
I'm imagining, Lorraine, but maybe I'm wrong, this affects you less, except for the atmospherics and the politics of it, but how do you see it?
Well, I mean, Aaron's right. We need to have a transparent national security apparatus, and that's important and well respected. And in fact, the food and agriculture sector under the CFIUS process would be one component of national security. I think we are again at the tip of the spear would be on the outcomes when the use of tariffs for national security purposes may then lead to retaliation on American ag products in other markets. And so I guess that is where our main concern would be when you look at the use of those tools.
Well, you'll remember those old debates we used to have, 15 years ago about comprehensive national security as the Chinese would talk about it, included economic security, and we would say, no, economics is separate and distinct, and you can't put that. Well, we've lost that debate at this point, and economic security is very much front and center, and particularly as you look at a 5G environment, which the entire economy is potentially manipulated by external forces, and our precious bodily fluids are all somehow exposed. So it has an enormous impact, and I think that the increasing role of the defense and intelligence agencies in economic policy is very new, and it's something to be carefully monitored and managed. I think if you look at the entire spectrum of our trade relationships with allies, friends, and competitors, you can take that area of sensitivity and really push that up the spectrum pretty quickly if you really follow the bouncing ball of security. So I really think that, you know, our job in the private sector and those that are interested in genuinely free and fair trade is to push that exception as far down the spectrum as we can and manage it carefully.
A quick lightning round, starting with you, Charles. Is the United States decoupling from Asia's economic architecture? Yes, no, impossible, I worry about it.
No, it's not. And you know, we talked about Asean and in Belt and Road, and I know there's a lot of concern about. But if you look at the stock of investment of U.S. investment in Southeast Asia, as an example, it far outweighs others in the region, with some exceptions. So no, we're not decoupling, and private sector will figure out ways to take advantage of regional architectures and the like. You know, I'm not sure that the current emphasis is doing us a lot of good. But I don't think it's necessarily short term. But I don't think it will have a fundamental effect on the U.S. private sector's engagement with Asia.
I agree. No, we are not decoupling. And from a food security standpoint, we cannot decouple. And the Asia Pacific is one of the largest and most growing dynamic markets for food and agriculture products, growing in demand for high quality, value added products. And so, you know, this integration that we've seen, I think will continue.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I think what policies do is have an effect on the speed of integration, but I think that the synergies between different markets is so important that it'll continue to happen. It's just a question of speed.
So the bad news is you're making us policy wonks feel pretty inconsiderate and unimportant, but the good news is this is the most optimistic answer we've gotten all day. The business of America is business, and we surge forward. I'm going to turn to the audience in one sec. I want to ask a last quick question. I've been fascinated for a long time. You guys are professionals in this business by the politics of trade in this country. Support for TPP is actually higher since 2016 in polls by the Chicago Council and others. Stephanie Murphy this morning gave a really, I thought, powerful speech on the need for centrist Democrats like herself, Republicans, to speak up for trade, and she's introducing legislation. But it sure is chaotic right now. I'd be interested, we'll start with you, Aaron, since you are on the front lines of this. How do you see the politics of trade, in particular with Asia, but generally in the U.S., in the front lines as you are in between business and government and politics?
It's complicated. I think there are some issues that are clearly bipartisan on the Hill and consistent with what the administration supports. There are some that that the administration supports that have bipartisan opposition. So the trick, and this is similar to negotiating a multilateral trade agreement, that you have to figure out where all the different moving pieces are to figure out what the right fit can be to be successful. But there is bipartisan support for trade, certainly on Capitol Hill and in the administration, and it's just finding the right combination of provisions to make it work.
And it's not the same combination. It's not the same moving pieces that it was 5-10 years ago. So,
yes, that's true.
So yes, trade is always politically complicated, but I guess I would underscore the fact that there is an understanding that from an agriculture and food export policy standpoint, you know, these export markets are really important for the success of our country and for our rural economies. We produce way more calories than we can consume here at home, and so export markets around the world are very important, ensuring that we have economic opportunity to send America's agricultural bounty to high demand areas. So I'll leave it at that.
We produce more calories than we can consume, but we sure try.
You know, trade, I mean, look, this is a politically polarized. I mean, we're politically polarized or politically splintered on every issue. It's not surprising that trade is another issue that splinters political support. Yes, support for trade is increasing significantly, but again, as Aaron pointed out, that if you get into questions of Huawei or other issues, things get complicated and messy pretty quick.
So let's open it up to questions from the floor, going back to some of the issues discussed in the earlier panel or what you heard. Today we have microphones. Feel free to give a short opinion as well if you want to react to anything you heard. Yeah, Deborah, in the front here.
Thanks. I was interested in asking a question of Aaron. You were talking earlier about U.S.-Japan and adding digital to the agenda. And I'm curious why you think digital should be added and not services, not investment, not IP. I mean, there's a million things that you could add. Why digital? And why not all those other things?
I was just listing it as a focus for us, but it's not to say that IP shouldn't be included. In fact, I think on most IP issues, U.S. and Japan are also very close, and clearly they were part of TPP together. So I think that there are many things that you could put together in an early harvest in a first round of agreements. For us, digital trade is what we focus the most on, and that's why I raised it.
I do think it has unique resonance in the context of U.S.-Japan. We talked about bad behavior in other countries on digital trade, and to the extent that the United States and Japan as a collective group want to send a message on things that are important and genuinely create, 21st century platinum standards, digital is one area. I'm not going to get into your why do it deal with the United States, which is another question, but I think digital has a special place in between the two countries, and there's a unique role for it. Not that there is not equal importance to be placed on services and investment, but digital is some place where we share pretty common values.
Professor Tu.
I have a question for Charles. China now is a very important topic in U.S. foreign policy. But in my impression, the number of China experts in the U.S. administration is smaller than the number of your family members. So why doesn't the U.S. government invite or recruit more China experts to make a smarter policy toward China?
Sometimes in this town, experience is equated with failure. And there is a question asked, a political question asked, who lost China? And it's all those smart people from previous administrations like Mike Green.
So I was just doing what you said to do.
So, I think the administration is learning that there is some value in having expertise or China expertise, but not everybody in the administration feels that way.
Charles, trying to deconstruct what happened in U.S.-China relations, I think a big factor was the financial crisis in 2008 and 2009, which really, in my view, scared Xi Jinping when he came to power from reform, made us look bad, made reform look bad. And that was a big tectonic shock. I think Xi Jinping's worldview is different. We pulled out of TPP. A lot of things happened. I'm asking you as both a trade pro and a China pro. TPP was designed in large part by Republican, it started with Bush, went through Obama. It was designed in large part to try to bend the arc of rulemaking in Asia to in a way, reinforce reformers inside China and to try to move towards more integration, not decoupling. Now we're going the other direction. Is there a scenario where we get back on the track of somewhere down the road of a strategy where we're looking at integrating China under rules that work for us, or do you think we sort of lost that? We, meaning you, lost that opportunity when we were in government.
I don't think we've reached history's end yet, Mike. So I certainly see scenarios in which the administration or administrations here recognize the value of a commitment to a multilateral rules-based order, and where Beijing recognizes that its true success did not come through authoritarian capitalism, but through the reforms that produced the explosion of non-state business actors. And yes, I think, sometimes you need to build down to build back up again. And so you asked about optimism. Yes, I'm very optimistic that both Beijing and Washington can return to a view in which they recognize the value is greater in a more liberal approach both to domestic economic reform and to integration with a broader rules-based order.
When you and I were in government over a decade ago, Chinese companies began listing in large numbers on the New York Stock Exchange. They were not subjected to the same external audit rules because there was a sense of momentum. Governor Zhou of the People's Bank of China promised change and reform. There's evidence that had been happening. Huawei, ZTE, these were interesting, innovative companies. Now they're huge companies. They can't undo their relationship with the Chinese government that easily. They're just the scale and growth of what's happened with Chinese companies means that original sin, if you will, the lack of external audits, the close symbiotic relationship with the Chinese government, including security services, all these things now become so big. I mean, the question is, it's going to be awfully hard to put the genie back in the bottle, isn't it?
It is, and I think that the important thing is for us to recognize that it's not only we that recognize that, but I think many Chinese businesses recognize that. You've seen increasingly Chinese businesses try to move as much of their not back office is not the word, but governance structure to places like Hong Kong, which at least until a couple of days ago was a true rule of law order, in part because they recognize that having that governance structure with exposure to audits and the rest of them made them more successful as businesses, maybe perhaps less successful as tools of the Chinese state or the Chinese Communist Party, but as businesses. And I do think, sometimes we forget that there are plenty of Chinese companies that are just trying to be successful and make money, which is what we understand and what we all want to see at the end of the day.
Yes, in the back.
Hi, my question is for Aaron, and I'd like to ask about the potential for increasing domestic concerns about privacy and how that might affect the consensus on digital trade and also in Congress, and also its sort of impact in trade agreements going forward.
So I think, first of all, we have at least privacy is a bipartisan issue in Congress, which makes it a possibility that we'll see it move forward, and it's something that we would really like to see. I think that the GDPR in Japan, the Personal Information Protection Act, and California, the CCPA, have all, among other things, done a really good job at focusing attention on the importance of making sure that consumers have the right to object to their data being processed and object to their data being used in certain ways that they don't want, and the right to access their data so they can take it from one place to another. And those are really important principles that we think should be part of a federal law. I think in terms of it impacting the digital trade agenda, I think it's important and would be helpful. I don't think it's a necessary part of ensuring the data can flow from one country to another. I think one of the things that Japan in particular has done really well is with its Personal Information Protection Act, making sure that when the data can continue to be transferred from Japan to another country, provided that there be accountability to how it's going to be treated when it's transferred to the other country. And I think that's the key that should permit data to flow across borders, regardless of what the privacy law is in the other country, as long as you are continuing to treat it the way it would have been in the original country. That's what should be important. That said, I think it is important that the U.S. Have a federal standard, and I think GDPR and the Japanese Personal Information Protection Act both have very similar rights, similar to what's in the California law, and those consumer rights that come from the OECD principles that the U.S. Helped form a while back, I think are important for federal law as well.
So I think this has been a really helpful panel. It added real dollars and cents to the policy and structural and systemic examination of Matt Goodman's panel. To me, it's in some ways a more optimistic panel. If you map out the interest groups around the trade question, Todo Sensei's picture of the cavemen was, I don't know if you were saying that's where we were or that's where we're heading, or both, but if you map out interest groups, you think about your industries, you think about Japan, Singapore, Australia, a lot of our partners, you think about still in China reformers who, if we get past the politics, to your point, Charles, see business and making money as much better than confrontation. You map all that out and we're in a bit of a mess, but there is some hope. And maybe next year, Sasaki-san, I don't know, maybe our 15th conference, the title will be, phew, decoupling didn't happen. We passed US-Japan, we got a US-China deal, we got access to ag markets, we started making digital rules. RCEP, I'm not so sure, but we'll see. But this, I think, was a hopeful reminder of all of the real interests, not just firms, but farmers, workers that depend on Asia and depend on trade, that's going to really, in a structural and in political way, have an influence on this that we sometimes lose in the tactical, ups and downs of trade politics in Washington. So thank you. I also want to thank Matt Goodman, Nick Sanchini from the Japan Chair, the teams from Simon Chair, Japan Chair, and Asia programs at CSIS. And thank you all for joining us. We'll see you next year at the next CSIS-JETRO conference. Thank you.